The Middle Ages witnessed one of the most decisive struggles in European history, the contest between spiritual authority and secular power for control over the direction of society. To understand how this conflict emerged, it is necessary to consider the conditions that shaped Europe before the confrontation fully unfolded. Over centuries, European institutions had gradually developed along paths that prepared the ground for a major transformation. The medieval empire had grown in strength and influence, defining its role as a force that claimed to maintain divine order in worldly affairs. At different moments, it had intervened in church matters, even helping to restore the papacy from a narrow, local institution into a body with universal ambitions. Yet these periods of imperial strength did not arise from any unique moral superiority of the empire itself. Rather, they reflected broader changes within European society, as the entire social structure slowly became more organized and stable. As feudal society moved beyond its earlier stage of disorder, it began to form more regular systems of law and governance. Such legal traditions were essential for any lasting social order, and their development coincided with a wider cultural awakening. The interaction between northern and southern peoples spread new intellectual influences across the continent, gradually transforming even the most remote regions. The older political outlook of a society shaped almost entirely by warfare and agriculture was slowly influenced by the revival of trade and urban life, particularly in regions where ancient cities had never entirely disappeared. Italy, southern France, and the river regions of the Maas, Scheldt, and Rhine became centres of renewed economic and social energy. Political actions had once been driven mainly by the ambitions of emerging national powers seeking territorial expansion or struggling to manage relations between local and central authority. Now, however, signs began to appear of a more reflective society, one that sought to justify and defend its institutions through theory as well as practice. Both political and religious structures increasingly required intellectual explanations, suggesting that European society was beginning to develop a conscious understanding of its own nature. In searching for evidence of this growing self-awareness, attention naturally turns to the institution that had preserved a continuous sense of organizational identity through centuries of change: the papacy. Although the papal office had experienced long periods of weakness during the 10th and 11th centuries, it had earlier asserted its claims to authority through legal and theological arguments that emphasized its supremacy. These ideas required only a renewed impulse to regain influence. That impulse emerged partly through imperial involvement in papal affairs and partly through cooperation between imperial power and popular religious reform movements. Yet the theory of absolute papal authority faced serious dangers. One risk was that local factions might seize control of the papacy and use it for their own interests, weakening its universal appeal. Strong imperial policies had recently protected the papacy from this threat, but this protection created another danger: the possibility that the papacy might become merely an instrument of imperial will, dependent on secular authority for its existence. Concern over this issue can be seen in the actions of Pope Leo IX, who refused to accept imperial appointment until his position had also been confirmed by the people of Rome. This decision affirmed a principle that would remain central to the identity of the Roman papacy. Its authority derived from its connection to the city of Rome and its claim of succession from the Apostle Peter. Recognition of any other source of legitimacy, even one offering immediate political advantage, would undermine the continuity that gave the papacy its unique standing. During Leo's rule, this principle was not extensively developed in theory, but he consistently asserted his supremacy over church institutions and demonstrated leadership in political and military matters, as well as religious affairs. After Leo's death in 1054, a new pope was chosen who strongly represented imperial interests. This figure, known as Victor II, had supported the independence of the German Church and maintained close cooperation between the papacy and the empire. His short rule was marked by general agreement between the two powers, and after the emperor's death in 1056, the Pope even assumed responsibility for governing the empire as guardian of the young heir, Henry IV. At first glance, this arrangement might appear to represent the fulfillment of papal ambition, since the Pope effectively exercised both spiritual and secular authority. In reality, however, such a situation raised concerns that the papacy might serve imperial priorities, rather than its own universal mission. Victor's early death and the temporary weakness of imperial authority created an opportunity for anti-imperial forces within Rome. Political rivalries quickly emerged, and powerful regional leaders sought to shape the future of the papacy. Through strategic alliances and careful negotiation, a new pope was elected, without direct imperial direction. This development marked a significant shift, demonstrating that the initiative in papal elections could originate from Rome itself, rather than from external authority. The election represented a coalition of Roman interests, reform-minded church leaders, and regional political powers, while imperial influence played little direct role. At this moment, a reform movement gained decisive influence, a movement determined to secure the independence of the papacy from all outside control. Later tradition often attributed this reforming policy to a single influential figure, the monk Hildebrand. Whether or not he personally directed events, there was a clear continuity in papal policy from this period onward. The central aim of the reform movement was to free the papacy from all external influence, whether imperial, national, or factional. The papacy was to be understood as a self-renewing institution, grounded entirely in its own spiritual authority, yet at the same time it claimed the right to intervene in all areas of human life. This vision reshaped the direction of church policy and laid the foundation for future conflicts. Political instability continued to affect papal succession. After another brief papal reign ended amid suspicion and intrigue, competing factions within Rome attempted to impose their own candidate. Rival claimants appeared, supported by different political and military forces, and power struggles determined the outcome. Eventually, a new pope emerged through the combined influence of regional rulers and reform leaders. This episode revealed how deeply political interests still shaped papal elections, and demonstrated the urgency of establishing clearer procedures. A major turning point came with a council held in Rome that sought to provide a constitutional framework for papal independence. The assembly established that the selection of a pope should rest primarily in the hands of leading church officials, known as cardinals. Until this time, the title of cardinal had referred simply to prominent clergy within the Roman Church, without forming a fixed or organized body. Their role had been largely advisory, assisting the Pope when consulted. The Council transformed this group into a more defined institution and assigned it a central role in papal elections. The cardinals were to initiate the choice of a new Pope. The people of Rome were to give their approval, and the emperor might grant confirmation. Although the exact procedure remained unclear and was not immediately implemented in practice, the principle was of enormous importance. If the papacy could claim to derive its authority from a clearly defined body of church leaders, external interference might be reduced and eventually eliminated. Even so, the decree did not end political manipulation. Influence could now be directed toward controlling the body of cardinals, rather than directly shaping the election itself. Papal politics entered a new phase, though the underlying struggles for power continued. The decree also addressed the role of the emperor reflecting a compromise between those who wished to preserve imperial involvement and those seeking complete independence. Such arrangements did not establish permanent rules, but expressed the balance of power at a particular moment. Their effectiveness depended on future circumstances and the willingness of society to accept them. The reform movement soon extended its influence beyond Rome, seeking support in other regions of Europe. Northern Italy, particularly Lombardy, became a crucial arena in the contest between papal and imperial authority. Its importance derived partly from geography, since communication between Germany and Italy passed through this region, but political and social factors were equally significant. The city of Milan had long held a leading position in northern Italy. It had served as an imperial residence in earlier times and developed strong commercial and cultural traditions. Its church maintained distinctive practices and traditions rooted in its own history, fostering a sense of independence from Roman authority. Milan's political structure reflected a complex social hierarchy. The bishop stood at the head of the city, supported by powerful nobles whose lands extended into the surrounding countryside, while lesser knights and a growing population of artisans formed additional layers of society. The urban population was becoming increasingly aware of its political identity and began to demand greater participation in public affairs. Tensions emerged between traditional feudal authority and movements seeking a more popular form of government based on elected leadership. Similar developments occurred in other cities of the region, creating a broader movement toward urban independence that would later transform European political life. Within this environment, a religious movement arose that criticized the moral condition of the established clergy. Influenced by broader spiritual trends spreading across Europe, reformers denounced practices they considered corrupt, especially the marriage of priests. Some went further, rejecting all material attachments and advocating extreme forms of religious discipline. Although their ideas were controversial and often condemned, their criticism of clerical behavior reinforced the wider movement for church reform. The call for moral purity and institutional independence strengthened the position of those who sought to free the church from secular control and reshape its structure according to spiritual principles. Bishop Aribo responded to the spread of the new preaching with harsh discipline. He interrogated suspects, condemned many as heretics, and ordered public burnings meant to frighten others into silence. Yet the message still travelled beyond the reach of church courts. It moved through workshops, markets, and crowded streets, where ordinary people were already angry about the privileges of the powerful. The new religious zeal did not create that resentment, but it gave it a sharper edge and a simple target. In Milan, popular agitators appeared, figures who could turn a crowd with a speech and channel frustration into action. Their rallying cry was direct and explosive. Married priests were presented as the symbol of everything corrupt and compromised in the established order. Under that slogan, groups within the city organized themselves, trained and armed. The city militia, usually a tool of local authority, became a weapon in the hands of the streets. The bishop was forced out, and the movement gained a name from its enemies. Pataria, a sneering label that suggested a mob of nobodies. But the scale and discipline of the uprising showed it was not a trivial disturbance. Its greatest advantage came when reformers in Rome recognized how useful this force could be and chose to link their own cause to it. The events in Milan are unusually clear because they were recorded from several angles, including the writings of a man who embodied the most uncompromising side of the reform campaign. Peter Damiani rose from monastic life into the highest circles of the church, and he became the fiercest public advocate of clerical celibacy. He wrote with the tone of a prosecutor, convinced that moral collapse among clergy was not a side issue, but an existential threat to the Church's authority. In his view, religious communities that should have been models of discipline had become places of scandal and abuse. Yet his solution was never to question the rigid, ascetic ideal itself. He believed the remedy was stronger discipline, harsher supervision, and deeper submission to the monastic spirit. At a major reform council held in Rome, his influence helped push through severe measures against clerical marriage. Alongside that, the reformers promoted a plan to reorganize diocesan clergy so they would live together under shared rules, closer to the controlled life of a monastery. The goal was not mainly spiritual elegance, but practical control, a system that made oversight of private conduct more direct and relentless. Rome chose Damiani as its envoy for a delicate assignment, to calm Milan without surrendering reform principles. His own description of the Lombard clergy is striking. He could not deny their learning, dignity, or devotion, and he described many as capable and respected men. The charge he returned to again and again was not criminal behaviour, but the fact that they lived openly with lawful wives. That detail, meant to condemn them, also revealed the weakness of the reform message in the eyes of many locals. The outcome of Damiani's mission exposed the complexity of the moment. One wave of popular anger, fired by ascetic preaching, lashed out against the local clergy. Then another wave, sometimes the same people shifting mood, erupted against the intrusion of a Roman representative, defending Milan's traditions and independence. Violence flared, and Damiani barely escaped alive. He left behind a city still divided, still armed, and still uncertain whether it was fighting for purity, for autonomy, or for both at once. From then on, the Pataria remained a useful ingredient in the reform coalition, but only when its energy aligned with the broader direction of Milanese politics. The alliance also carried risk. The movement had roots in ideas the Church considered doctrinally suspect, and that was never a comfortable foundation for a campaign claiming moral authority. Still, the reform strategists were often willing to tolerate theological irregularities when they gained political leverage. Until this point, another force shaping Italy's future can be kept in the background, but it soon becomes unavoidable: the Normans. Long before they became a major Italian power, they had reshaped themselves in northern France. After generations of raiding, settlement in Normandy produced a population that absorbed local culture with surprising speed while keeping a sharp taste for war. Within a few generations, they were known for both discipline and aggression, shrewdness and endurance. Many stayed rooted, yet the old instinct for adventure did not disappear. Bands of Norman fighters continued to drift across Western and Southern Europe, offering their swords wherever profit, land, or reputation might be won. Southern Italy offered exactly the conditions that drew them. Early in the 11th century, a group returning from pilgrimage passed through the region near Salerno and entered local service against Muslim raiders. News travelled back north. Italy was rich, divided and vulnerable, with no stable government capable of enforcing order. In the years that followed, more Norman companies arrived, fighting for pay and plunder in the constant small wars that defined the area. The political landscape was fragmented. Along parts of the eastern coast and in the far south, the Byzantine Empire still claimed authority, but its rule was often oppressive and ineffective. It drained resources without developing the land and could not decisively repel pressures from rival powers. On the western side, Muslim influence had been strong, and Sicily had come under Muslim control. Elsewhere, a patchwork of small Lombard principalities survived, states that were the worn-down remnants of a once formidable kingdom. Their relationship to Byzantium shifted from submission to independence depending on the moment, and they were unreliable allies for any larger power. German rulers occasionally attempted to push Byzantine influence out of Italy, and these local princes sometimes offered support, but nothing like a coherent front existed. What southern Italy lacked was a single ruthless and energetic force willing to sweep aside the fragments and build a new order by conquest. The Normans proved capable of exactly that. Around 1041, a new and more coordinated Norman influx appeared, led by members of the Hauteville family. They arrived at the invitation of a Lombard adventurer promising them a share of conquered lands in campaigns against Byzantium in Apulia. The fighting that followed was brutal and opportunistic, driven more by personal gain than by any larger political vision. Success came quickly, and the Normans then sought legitimacy to stabilize their gains. They chose a leader from among themselves, William, known for his strength in battle, and he received a title from a local prince, reinforced by a marriage alliance. A group that had arrived as hired muscle was beginning to look like a recognized political power. When William died in 1046, his brother Drogo succeeded him and gained broader recognition, again strengthened by marriage ties to the southern princes. This coincided with a moment when the German emperor turned his attention south after intervening in Rome. He summoned southern rulers to his court and treated the region as if it were within his authority to distribute. Drogo received formal confirmation of his position, now framed as a vassal relationship. Through the convenient language of feudal politics, Norman warbands were transformed into respectable members of the European hierarchy. In a few years, they were no longer described as outsiders, but as legitimate lords. Legitimacy did not make them less dangerous. Once their leaders recognized that no local force could stop them, they pressed northward. That advance brought them into collision with a papacy that was rediscovering ambitions in temporal power. Under Pope Leo IX, the papal court began to act not only as a spiritual authority, but as a ruler defending territory. Norman expansion alarmed nearly everyone in Italy. It was a familiar pattern. Foreign fighters invited as helpers become masters. Yet the Italian powers could not muster the unity or strength to remove them. The Pope became the one figure around whom such resistance as existed might gather. Leo acted early. He sought allies wherever he could find them, travelling north to appeal for support from the empire and its leaders. He even explored cooperation with Byzantium, believing that the nearby Byzantine presence was less threatening than unchecked Norman power. The response was disappointing. Byzantium could offer little. German churchmen were hesitant. Northern Italian princes had other priorities, and local Greek communities in Italy could not be depended upon. Meanwhile, the Normans were ready to fight, and their scattered factions found common cause when faced with papal opposition. Leo eventually assembled a small force, including a hard core of Swabian troops, and as the army moved south, it attracted irregular fighters, drawn by the promise of loot. The Pope himself took command, leading the expedition through Benevento toward Apulia, where the Normans gathered. The decisive clash came in June 1053 near Civitate. The outcome was immediate and brutal. The Italian contingents in the papal army broke and fled, leaving the Swabians to face the Norman attack. They were cut down almost to the last man, and the Norman victory was complete. Then the scene shifted in a way that seemed almost theatrical. The papal supporters who had taken refuge in Civitate expected massacre. Instead, the Norman leaders approached with formal reverence, fell at the Pope's feet, and begged forgiveness. They escorted him to Benevento, where he remained for months, his presence perhaps restraining a direct Norman assault on the city. In that world, piety and violence often appeared together, and gestures of devotion could follow acts of ruthless conquest without any sense of contradiction. Leo's role as a war leader did not please everyone among the strict reformers, and endless hostility to the papacy did not suit Norman interests either. After Leo's death, Norman power consolidated under younger, more ambitious figures, including Richard of Aversa and Robert of Apulia, remembered for cunning and boldness. At the same moment, the reform leadership in Rome, guided by Hildebrand's strategic instincts, recognized what could be gained from harnessing Norman force instead of fighting it. The offer was simple: recognition and legitimacy in exchange for loyalty to the papal throne. Richard accepted first, and Robert followed. At a gathering in southern Italy soon after the major Roman Reform Council of 1059, both men appeared before Pope Nicholas II and formally entered a feudal relationship with the papacy. They promised fidelity, protection, and obedience, while the Pope invested them with lofty titles that matched their ambitions more than the reality on the ground. This was one of the first times the papacy used feudal bonds as a practical tool to control large territories. The alliance did not always run smoothly, but it became a major pillar of papal strength, securing the southern flank of the reform movement. To the north, the papacy gained a different kind of support, less volatile and often more reliable, in Tuscany. The region formed a broad barrier between Rome and the routes of German armies. Its ruling women, Beatrice and her daughter Matilda, used marriage alliances to position themselves against imperial dominance, linking their house with the powerful family of Lorraine. Beyond politics, both were passionate supporters of the moral reform movement associated with Cluny. They combined intense religious commitment with hard, practical energy. Rome could count on their resources, their fortresses, and their willingness to act. In the long struggle that followed, Tuscany often blocked imperial expeditions and offered refuge when popes were threatened. As long as a pope could reach Matilda's territory, there was usually a place to regroup and survive. By the early 1070s, the Reform Party could draw on several key assets: a program centred on a disciplined clergy, opposition to buying church offices, and elections meant to be controlled by churchmen rather than by force or bribery. Militant urban supporters in northern Italy, the wealth and protection of Tuscany in the centre, and Norman military power in the south, now tied by oath to Rome. Added to these were widespread resentments inside many kingdoms, anger against local rulers and church elites, which the papacy learned to encourage and redirect toward its own goals. These forces were soon coordinated by one of the most controversial personalities of the age, Hildebrand. He was praised as a saintly reformer by admirers and denounced as a ruthless schemer by enemies. The surviving portraits are shaped by passion and propaganda. His actions and his own letters offer a steadier guide, though even they must be read with caution. It is likely that papal policy from the downfall of an earlier reform-minded pope onward was strongly influenced by him. His origins are unclear, though he seems to have been connected to Rome. He lived with monastic ideals, believing that the world could be reshaped by the discipline and moral intensity of the cloister. Yet he was never the quiet monk of a cell. From the start he appears as an administrator, active in councils, negotiations, and the financial recovery of the papal household. His talent for managing revenue brought accusations of corruption. But in an era of chaos, it also made him effective. He rose to the rank of archdeacon and held a central role in papal government until his election to the papacy in 1073. His harshest critics accused him of lacking scruples, a charge often levelled at powerful organisers. To him, methods mattered less than the goal. He was not a systematic theologian, and he could overlook doctrinal problems if an alliance served the reform agenda. He worked with Milan's radical activists. He tried to shield controversial figures when he believed the larger cause required it, He even drew suspicion for statements that seemed to undermine sacramental certainty when clergy were corrupt. In practice, he gathered allies wherever they could be found and justified flexibility by the magnitude of the transformation he intended. Under Nicholas II and his successors, the Reformed papacy pushed its principles outward across Europe. In southern Italy, a series of church gatherings backed by Norman power promoted stricter clerical discipline. In the north, Roman envoys tried to influence the turbulent Milanese situation with mixed results. In France, reform councils condemned corruption and clerical marriage, yet royal authority made clear it intended to control the national church. Deals were struck when useful, lifting penalties in exchange for visible acts of piety such as founding monasteries. In England, disputes over high church appointments tended to be settled in ways that protected local control. Again and again, the reform leadership showed a pattern: firmness about moral principles, but caution whenever strong national resistance made direct confrontation too costly. Germany, however, was the most delicate arena. The German king's claim over Italy made conflict almost unavoidable, and the papacy's ability to sanction an imperial coronation was a powerful lever. German politics were also unstable. After the death of Henry III, the empire was governed by his widow Agnes as regent for her young son Henry. She was educated and devout, but politically unprepared for the brutal realities of German power. She relied on advisors who lacked support among the major princes and bishops. In Germany, effective government depended on balancing the interests of great territorial lords with the leading churchmen. Local rulers could not be forced into obedience. They had to be managed through compromise and patronage. The monarchy did not command deep loyalty on its own. Unity came more from a shared interest among the powerful than from any fixed devotion to royal authority. The Reform Council of 1059 became a breaking point. One might expect the imperial government to resist its claims, but the strongest reaction came from the German clergy themselves, who framed the issue as a defense of national rights. Without clear evidence that the region approved, a German church assembly denounced the Roman decisions, treated the Pope's authority as invalid, and even ordered his name removed from public prayers. When a papal envoy arrived seeking an explanation, he was deliberately humiliated, kept away from court for days, and dismissed without an answer. The message was unmistakable. Rome's new rules would not be accepted quietly in Germany. The conflict sharpened when Nicholas II died. Roman leaders appealed to the German regent to nominate a successor, invoking the young king's traditional role in Roman affairs. The regent hesitated and delayed, suggesting a council might settle the question. The Reform Party did not wait. After months of uncertainty, it pushed through the election of Anselm of Lucca as Pope Alexander II, relying on the cardinal's moral authority and the physical support of Norman troops. Alexander was linked to Milan's reform movement and closely connected to Tuscany's ruling house, making him a living symbol of the coalition Rome was building. Germany answered with an open challenge. At an assembly in Basel, German leaders reaffirmed the king's traditional claims in Rome, rejected Alexander's election, and chose their own candidate, Cadalus of Parma, who took the name Honorius II. The lines were now drawn. The harmony that had once seemed possible between empire and papacy gave way to the underlying contradiction between two systems that both claimed supreme authority. Yet Germany's defiance lacked the hard force that earlier rulers had used to make their will effective. The new claimant was left largely to fend for himself. Only after many months, supported by Lombard weapons and money, did he feel strong enough to march on Rome. For a moment he seemed close to success, until he was confronted by Tuscan power and forced to withdraw. Both rivals were then ordered to await judgment from the king. That sudden reversal was driven by a dramatic upheaval inside Germany itself. The regency of Agnes had produced widespread dissatisfaction, and opposition gathered around Archbishop Hanno of Cologne. In a bold coup, Hanno arranged for the young king to board a boat on the Rhine, then had it rowed swiftly away under guard. The teenager tried to escape by jumping into the river and swimming for shore, but he was seized and brought back. With the king in his custody, Hanno displaced the regent and took control of government through a coalition of bishops. The episode revealed something important about German political structure. A formal regency, in the later sense of a hereditary monarchy, did not fit easily into German traditions. Authority was not anchored in a stable royal institution, but in the balance among princes. In that moment, the strongest representatives of shared national interest were the leading bishops. Instead of choosing a powerful adult king to restore order, the princes accepted a clerical management of the realm, likely because the higher clergy had grown enormously influential and several extraordinary men were available to lead. For a time, the government functioned through a rotating arrangement in which, whichever bishop hosted the king, became the effective manager of policy. It was a striking sign of the Church's political weight in the empire. Such a system could not last. Power soon concentrated in the hands of Hanno and Adalbert of Bremen. Under Hanno's influence, German policy shifted toward compromise with Rome. A church gathering at Augsburg adopted a tone so conciliatory it amounted to tacit recognition that the Roman electoral body had legitimate authority in papal elections. The following year, a larger council met at Mantua within Tuscan territory. Holding such a council under German influence ran against the Reform Party's instinct to keep papal matters entirely within the Church's control. But the results favoured Rome. Alexander defended the legitimacy of his election and was confirmed as Pope. The rival claimant's cause collapsed, and Germany retained a limited claim: the right to judge contested elections, even while accepting the candidate chosen by the Roman Reform coalition. While Hanno negotiated in Italy, Adalbert guided the young king's daily life and began to eclipse Hanno's influence. When Henry was declared of age at 15, Adalbert's hold over him grew stronger. Writers, hostile to Henry, later blamed Adalbert for indulging the king and corrupting his character while presenting Hanno as a stern, moral disciplinarian. Such simple moral storytelling cannot fully explain the disasters that followed. Still, Adalbert's strong sense of national rights likely encouraged resistance to papal interference, and he was even suspected of imagining an independent Northern Church leadership that could challenge Rome's claims. In the decade before open war erupted between Henry and Hildebrand, the political ground hardened into the shape it would hold for years. A young king, clever but impulsive, found himself surrounded by controlling advisors and political traps. Marriage alliances arranged in childhood were enforced as tools of state. Enemies gathered inside his court and beyond it. In such conditions, a ruler with energy could easily swing between rebellion against restraint and dependence on whichever faction offered him freedom of action. Henry's reputation, like Hildebrand's, was distorted by extremes. Supporters portrayed him as a patient victim of conspiracies, surviving through personal integrity. Enemies painted him as monstrous, a destroyer of church and people. A colder view sees a capable man facing a crisis created by decades of structural tension. Without a stable party base to sustain him, threatened by betrayal even within his own household, yet able to resist and endure through a long reign. Meanwhile, in Italy, the same fault lines deepened. The fighting in Milan raised a question that could not be avoided. Where did the bishops of Lombard cities truly draw their authority? From the king and empire, or from Rome and reform? When Milan's archbishop died, one faction sought confirmation from Henry, while the Pataria, backed by Rome, supported its own candidate. Once again, Roman involvement sparked resistance, and the reform candidate was driven out. The imperial side continued to strengthen its network. The old rival claimant in Parma died, and his successor was aligned with German interests. A key administrative figure from the imperial system was placed in one of Italy's most influential sees. Across northern Italy, appointments and alliances increasingly favoured the imperial party. The stage was being set, piece by piece, for a confrontation that would no longer be limited to speeches, synods, and contested elections, but would test the meaning of authority itself in medieval Europe. The rebellion in Saxony gave the papacy an opportunity it could hardly ignore. The Saxon leaders presented their cause as a struggle against a ruler they described as unjust and oppressive. Such appeals had always attracted ambitious popes, who saw in them a chance to extend spiritual authority into political life. From this moment onward, Gregory worked steadily to preserve and strengthen the hostility between the Saxons and the German king. The changing fortunes of Henry IV would rise and fall according to the success or failure of this alliance against him. Even before Gregory assumed full control of papal policy, the groundwork had been laid. Several of Henry's advisors, whose influence opposed the reform movement, had already been excommunicated. The stage was prepared for a direct confrontation. At a moment when Henry faced growing unrest in Saxony and struggled to maintain control, Gregory moved decisively. He summoned the German clergy to attend a council under papal representatives, where all disputes between the crown and the church would be addressed. The king appeared willing to consider compromise, but the German clergy refused. Led by powerful archbishops, they rejected the idea of submitting to a council, organised by Rome or presided over by papal officials. Their resistance reflected a growing sense that the issue at stake was not simply religious discipline, but the independence of national authority. Supporters of the papal cause portrayed this refusal as evidence that German church leaders feared exposure of their corruption. Yet the real significance of Gregory's policy soon became clear. The central issue was not the moral character of individual clergy, but the very nature of clerical authority. At a major Roman assembly in 1075, Gregory introduced a decisive measure: the prohibition of lay investiture. This reform had been discussed before, but now it became the central aim of papal policy. The investiture of a bishop or abbot was the act by which a ruler granted the symbols of office and confirmed the appointment. Even if a candidate had been properly chosen by church authorities, receiving final authority from a secular ruler meant that the church's independence remained limited. Gregory recognized that this practice was the key reason why rulers across Europe resisted papal reform. Bishops, who owed their position to kings, were naturally loyal to them, and this loyalty obstructed efforts to impose church discipline from Rome. If the papacy could secure exclusive control over the appointment of high clergy, it would gain influence over political life throughout Christendom. The consequences of such a shift promised enormous power. Control of appointments would gradually eliminate the idea of a national church in each kingdom. Instead, the clergy of every land would form a network bound directly to Rome, loyal first to the papacy rather than to local rulers. This vision was not merely theoretical. A set of principles associated with Gregory's policy outlined an ambitious program for papal authority. These ideas asserted that the Roman Church derived its authority directly from divine origin, that the Pope alone possessed universal power within the Church, and that he could appoint or remove bishops at will. They declared that he stood above all earthly rulers, that no authority could judge him, and that he might even depose emperors. They also claimed that the Roman Church was incapable of error and that those who rejected its authority could not be considered true members of the Christian community. Most striking of all was the assertion that the Pope could release subjects from obedience to unjust rulers. Taken together, these principles reveal a political vision of extraordinary scope. The aim was nothing less than the submission of all earthly authority to the judgment of Rome. If fully realized, Europe would have been organized under a vast religious government, centered in the papacy and extending its influence into every kingdom. Supported by religious fear, legal tradition, and intellectual authority, such a system might have dominated medieval society. Yet, it was fundamentally opposed to emerging forces that valued local identity and political independence. National traditions and regional loyalties resisted uniform control, while individual thought and intellectual freedom posed an even greater threat to a system seeking universal obedience. This program was never openly proclaimed in its entirety, but it shaped Gregory's actions throughout his rule. His prohibition of lay investiture applied to all Christian lands, yet Germany became the primary target. Its claim to imperial authority made it a prize of exceptional importance, and its internal divisions offered the papacy an opportunity to exploit local opposition to royal power. When the decree reached Germany, however, the political situation did not favour papal ambitions. Henry had recently defeated the Saxon rebels in battle and secured the imprisonment of their leaders. Although new resentments had been created by this victory, the king's position was stronger than it had been for years. His letters to the Pope at this time were moderate in tone, suggesting a desire to avoid open conflict while maintaining traditional royal rights. He continued to appoint bishops and abbots, just as earlier emperors had done, selecting candidates of good reputation and avoiding accusations of corruption. In this respect, he followed established policy rather than introducing new abuses. The conflict over investiture, therefore, was rooted not in moral failings, but in a fundamental disagreement over authority. For a time, both sides delayed open confrontation, communicating through private correspondence while testing potential allies. The king sought support in northern Italy and even attempted to win over the Normans, urging them to shift their loyalty from the papacy to the empire. Meanwhile, factions within Rome that opposed papal dominance began to stir once more. Yet Gregory decided that further delay would weaken his position. Early in 1076, he sent envoys to Henry with a firm demand. The king must abandon the practice of investing bishops, dismiss his excommunicated advisors, and appear before the Pope to seek forgiveness for his offences. Compliance would restore peace. Refusal would bring excommunication. The papacy framed the conflict as a matter of moral discipline, focusing on the king's personal conduct rather than constitutional principles. This approach followed earlier precedents, presenting political intervention as a response to ethical failure. The German reaction was immediate and forceful. Royal advisors and church leaders alike treated the papal challenge as an attack on national authority. A council of German bishops was summoned, and in early 1076 they assembled in large numbers. The gathering condemned Gregory's conduct, accused him of abusing power and violating established procedures, and declared themselves released from obedience to him. The king endorsed their decision and addressed letters both to the Pope and to the Roman people, urging them to withdraw their allegiance. The arguments on both sides emphasized personal accusations rather than structural issues. Each party portrayed the other as morally corrupt and illegitimate. Yet beneath these charges lay a deeper conflict. The empire sought to preserve its traditional rights over local political and ecclesiastical affairs, while the papacy aimed to extend its authority over rulers and subjects alike. Moral language served as a convenient justification for a struggle over power. The papal response was swift and uncompromising. At a Roman assembly, Gregory pronounced the Excommunication of Henry and declared his subjects released from their oath of loyalty. This action transformed the relationship between church and state. The ruler was no longer seen as a sovereign authority governing his realm, but as a subordinate, whose legitimacy depended upon papal approval. By dissolving the bond between king and subjects, the papacy asserted the right to intervene directly in political order. This theory drew strength from the feudal ideas of the age. Allegiance was often viewed as conditional, subject to change if obligations were not fulfilled. If subjects could be persuaded that their ruler had violated moral or legal duties, they might feel justified in withdrawing obedience. Gregory's policy applied this principle on a grand scale, using spiritual authority to reshape political loyalty. The effects of the excommunication were complex. Many supporters abandoned Henry, but their actions often reflected existing rivalries, rather than fear of spiritual punishment. Rebellion had long been a feature of German politics, and papal condemnation merely provided a convenient justification. In northern Italy, church leaders loyal to the empire responded by denouncing the Pope in return. Even within Rome, opposition to Gregory did not automatically translate into support for imperial control. A second German council later confirmed Gregory's deposition, but the king failed to secure decisive support for military action. This hesitation proved costly. While Henry delayed, opposition forces organized and prepared to replace him. Leading princes assembled and imposed strict conditions upon the king, demanding that he obtain absolution from the Pope within a fixed period or forfeit his throne. These negotiations weakened royal authority and revealed the growing independence of regional powers. Determined to regain his position, Henry undertook a dramatic journey across the Alps in the winter of 1076. Accompanied by only a small group, including his family, he crossed dangerous mountain passes and entered Italy. There, he found support among the Lombards, who urged him to lead an attack against the Pope. Instead, he declared his intention to seek reconciliation. Meanwhile, Gregory was travelling northward, hoping to preside over a council in Germany that would settle the dispute. Learning of the king's approach, he withdrew to a fortified castle in Tuscany. At this fortress, the two rivals finally met. Henry appeared as a penitent, seeking absolution from the papal ban. According to later accounts, he waited for days in humility before being admitted. Gregory eventually granted forgiveness, restoring him to communion in a ceremony marked by public emotion. This moment became one of the most famous episodes of medieval history, often interpreted as a dramatic victory of spiritual authority over royal power. Yet the consequences were ambiguous. By securing absolution, Henry removed the justification for rebellion and regained political leverage. The Pope, meanwhile, lost the opportunity to impose a settlement under his own conditions. The conflict was far from resolved. German opposition continued, and within a short time, rival factions elected a new king in defiance of Henry's restored status. The struggle now entered a new phase. Civil war divided Germany, and the papacy eventually recognized Henry's rival, though the conflict remained uncertain. Military campaigns followed, alliances shifted, and the contest between empire and papacy became a broader political struggle rather than a purely religious dispute. Opponents of Gregory responded by organizing their own resistance. Assemblies of bishops declared him deposed and elected a rival pope. The empire thus produced its own spiritual leader, mirroring the divisions that already existed within the kingdom. Electoral procedures for both church and state remained unclear, and these crises gradually forced institutions to develop more defined systems of governance. Henry eventually carried the conflict into Italy once more. Supported by loyal followers and welcomed by many northern cities, he advanced toward Rome. After years of negotiation and military pressure, he entered the city and secured recognition for his candidate as Pope. He was crowned emperor, achieving the goal denied to him for decades. Gregory, however, continued to resist from a fortified position, awaiting assistance from his Norman allies. Their arrival changed the course of events, but brought destruction as well as victory. The Norman forces entered Rome and subjected the city to brutal plunder, punishing its inhabitants for opposing the papacy. The devastation destroyed whatever support Gregory still possessed among the Roman population. Forced to leave the city, he departed with his allies into exile, ending his career far from the centre of the power he had struggled to build. The conflict between empire and papacy had transformed the political landscape of Europe. It revealed the limits of both spiritual and temporal authority, reshaped alliances, and set the stage for continuing struggles over power, legitimacy, and the relationship between church and state. Gregory's enemies expected exile to break him. Instead, Salerno became the stage for one last display of the same relentless confidence that had shaped his entire rule. Messages went out across Latin Christendom through trusted envoys. Not softened by defeat, not apologetic, and not cautious. The tone remained defiant, as if distance from Rome had changed nothing. He called on supporters to gather force, to raise an army, and to come to the aid of their embattled spiritual leader. In that final appeal, there was already something that later generations would recognize in the great expeditions to the east. A leader speaking as if the struggle itself was larger than any one life, insisting that the cause must pass forward without hesitation, without compromise, and without the slightest hint of doubt. Death was clearly approaching, and Gregory knew it. The men who had carried his program across Europe gathered around him, asking for guidance as if a storm was about to break, and only his voice could tell them where to stand. Yet he did not publicly name a successor or attempt to lock the future into a single choice. He died on May 15th, 1085. The words later remembered as his final summary were stark and unforgettable. He had pursued justice, he had opposed wrongdoing, and for that reason he was dying far from home. The line reads like a verdict, not merely on his own fate, but on the age that produced him. Only a short time after Gregory's death, the southern pillar of papal power also disappeared. Robert Guiscard, the figure who had turned a band of adventurers into the core of a new territorial state, died in the same year. His ambitions had stretched beyond Italy, toward the eastern Mediterranean, where the imagination of the West was already beginning to drift. His death, arriving before those larger dreams, could harden into a permanent obsession, may have saved the Norman realm from being pulled apart by overreach. Over the next century, that kingdom would develop with a steadiness that invites comparison to other Norman experiments in state building, even though the conditions were different. With such a strong beginning, it might seem natural that southern power would shape the entire peninsula. Yet the long road toward Italian unity would eventually run from the far north, not from the Norman south. The investiture conflict remains the clearest path through this complicated landscape because it ties together local quarrels and continental politics. For roughly 20 years after Gregory's death, Henry IV continued to survive against shifting coalitions that rose, collapsed, and reformed against him. Behind the personal insults and the religious slogans, a deeper tension can be traced. Older ideas of German kingship, inherited from earlier imperial traditions, colliding with a world increasingly shaped by feudal bonds and by the attempt to extend those bonds into church life. Once the surface drama is set aside, the outlines of change become easier to see. The king commonly stood alongside much of the higher clergy and found practical support in the growing city communities along the Rhine and the Danube. His opponents tended to gather among the lay nobility, especially in the southern regions, and they looked for allies wherever they could find them, among reform-minded churchmen and among the great rural population of the north, particularly in Saxony. One useful way to understand these alignments is to focus on two competing visions of order. Henry can be viewed as the defender of a royal peace, a strong central authority meant to impose law, restrain private violence, and enforce obedience. His enemies, by contrast, often leaned toward a different model, stability achieved not by one commanding power, but by a pact among rival lords, reinforced by religious pressure and collective vows. This perspective makes the endless disputes of Henry's later reign look less like petty squabbling and more like a struggle over what government was supposed to mean. Until 1088, discontented factions rallied around Hermann of Luxembourg, but the movement felt hollow, more a vehicle for opposition than a convincing alternative kingship. Hermann's death forced the anti-Henry camp to search again for a figure who could unite them. Around the same time, the Reform Party in Rome faced its own problem. Gregory's successor had never managed to dislodge Henry's rival pope from the city. The Reformers then elevated a far stronger leader, a French monk shaped by the Cluniac world, who would become known as Urban II. He would later be remembered for the First Crusade, but at this stage his task was to rebuild the papal position in Italy and to revive the wider reform agenda. Urban's early moves were political as much as spiritual. He strengthened ties with the great Countess of Tuscany by arranging her marriage to a very young Welf prince from Bavaria, drawing into the papal orbit a family long associated with German opposition to Henry. The emperor answered with another Italian campaign and came close to breaking the Tuscan alliance and pulling Matilda's lands back under imperial control. Yet just as success seemed near, a fresh surge of reformist enthusiasm swept through northern Italy. Lombardy, which had often leaned toward the empire, swung dramatically toward the papal cause. A league of cities, led by Milan, committed itself for years against Henry, and the hardest blow fell inside the imperial household itself. Henry's son Conrad, raised largely in Lombardy and shaped by its politics, openly joined the papal side. Urban did not immediately gain full control of Rome. For years his faction struggled against the imperial-backed pope entrenched across the river. Only later did Urban reach the Lateran securely, and even then his position remained contested. In 1095 he left Italy on a journey that would display papal reach more vividly than anything since Gregory's peak. His first major gathering took place at Piacenza in the wide Lombard plain, a landscape that would host many such assemblies. There he again condemned Henry and, for the first time in this conflict, issued a public appeal for Western help to the Eastern Empire, which was under growing pressure. At Cremona, Conrad performed acts of submission designed to show that he was the Pope's chosen instrument in Italy. The Pope, in return, held out the glittering promise of the imperial crown, while firmly reserving papal claims over the appointment of bishops. A proposed marriage tie linking Conrad to the Norman power of Sicily appeared to complete an extraordinary coalition, connecting reform Rome, northern Italian cities, Tuscan strength, and southern arms into one aligned front. Milan offered an even more symbolic victory. The city's church traditions had long been proud and distinct, but now the archbishop publicly renounced the imperial connection that had shaped episcopal authority for generations. The Reform Party celebrated its own martyrs and elevated past urban agitators into heroic figures, presenting city struggle and religious purification as parts of the same sacred story. For the first time, the Milanese church world moved decisively into the orbit of Roman policy. By this point, the papacy could look across Italy and see a level of cooperation that earlier reformers could only have imagined. From Lombardy, the momentum carried westward through Burgundy into France. Moving up the Rhone, Urban acted with the confidence of a ruler rather than a guest, granting privileges, deciding disputes, dedicating churches, and behaving as if papal authority was the most real sovereignty in the region. At Clermont, he presided over an assembly packed with the energies of southern Europe. Germany and England were largely absent, and the meeting reflected the Romanic world far more than the northern kingdoms. Even so, the council asserted papal moral authority with striking boldness, condemning the French king for personal misconduct, while stopping short of dissolving his people's political loyalty to him. The reform principles were restated with full force. Clergy were to be chosen properly, live in chastity, and remain free from secular control. Then came the appeal that transformed the atmosphere of the age. Urban redirected the violence of Western society away from local feuds and toward a distant goal: the recovery of Jerusalem. Modern explanations often emphasize material motives: land, wealth, adventure, social pressure. But the immediate power of the moment was its idealism. The demand was framed as something beyond ordinary politics, and the crowd responded as if swept into a different world. The famous cry that it was God's will captured the tone of the first wave, an emotion that overran practical calculation and made men believe they were stepping into sacred history. For Henry IV, this surge was less fatal than it appeared at first. The crusading movement took deepest hold among the Romanic peoples. The German lands were slower to ignite. If Clermont marked the final collapse of the old imperial ability to shape the papacy, it also opened a new period for Germany's internal development. With Rome's energy turned toward the crusade, pressure on Henry eased. Conrad's Italian kingship, tied together by fragile loyalties, proved unreliable, and many German nobles, never fully devoted to papal rule, drifted back toward their emperor out of habit and interest. Between 1095 and 1104, Henry experienced the rarest thing in his reign: a stretch of comparative calm. German princes formally cut Conrad out of the succession and crowned Henry's younger son as heir. When the imperial-backed pope died in 1100, Henry did not push hard to keep the schism alive. He seemed prepared to seek a negotiated settlement in Rome, perhaps believing the long conflict could finally be closed. Yet another rebellion was already forming, the last and the most personal. The younger Henry began to cultivate support among the lay nobility, the class that had often resisted his father's attempts to strengthen royal authority. The old issue returned in a new form: whether the kingdom would be governed by a central power claiming to protect order and restrain violence, or by a coalition of great lords who preferred a ruler that would not govern too strongly. Henry IV fought this final struggle first with some success, in regions where he still had loyal backing. Then, exhausted by years of conflict, he surrendered his crown to his son and withdrew. His supporters held on briefly, but his death at Liège in 1106 ended the last organized resistance to the new regime. The pattern that followed became one of the most revealing lessons of the entire era. Again and again, rulers who gained power with papal help discovered that the alliance became unworkable once real governance began. The papacy and the empire represented two visions that could not be permanently reconciled. Henry IV's reputation suffered heavily in later memory for a simple reason. The social groups he defended had little control over written history, while the educated clergy and aristocratic circles he challenged dominated the record. In an age when learning belonged largely to church institutions, resistance to the organized church almost guaranteed a hostile portrait. Henry V's accession had been encouraged by papal policy under Pascal II, and the triumph of the First Crusade had raised papal prestige to new heights. Renewing the ban on lay investiture in 1106, Pascal signalled that the reform agenda would not retreat. Outside Germany, that policy had already achieved major successes, and the papacy expected obedience from a German king who owed so much to papal approval. The opposite occurred. Henry V quickly discovered that ruling Germany required the same kinds of support his father had relied on. He cultivated ties with the great Western cities, which were awakening to new political confidence. He also benefited from the growing pool of armed men produced by feudal society, fighters who wanted action, reward, and direction. Where crusading had offered an outlet elsewhere, Henry offered a more traditional one, a massive Italian expedition. In 1110, his summons drew an army said to number in the tens of thousands. Crossing the Alps in 2 columns, the force overwhelmed resistance. Northern Italian communes submitted and paid contributions. Cities that refused were punished harshly, and the mood of the campaign hinted at the hard edge that later imperial dynasties would bring to Italy. Even Matilda, the great Tuscan power, offered troops, and the offer was refused. From the borderlands near Rome, Henry opened negotiations with the Pope in a familiar way. Privately, and with the hope of striking a bargain that would secure him against domestic rivals. The agreement the two sides outlined was astonishing in its ambition. It proposed that imperial church princes should give up the lands and temporal privileges they had accumulated over centuries and live only from tithes and voluntary gifts. In exchange, the emperor would abandon investiture and recognize papal authority fully, while the papacy would confirm its own rights and properties. If carried out, it would have removed the central cause of conflict. Bishops would no longer be political princes, and the king would have no reason to insist on controlling their appointments. The papacy would gain a clergy bound to Rome, and the empire would gain relief from the struggle, at least in theory. The flaw was obvious the moment the plan became public. It demanded sacrifice from a class unwilling to be sacrificed. Italian clergy, already pressured by rising cities, were less alarmed, but German bishops and abbots had spent generations building their princely status and refused to surrender it. They denounced the plan as intolerable and forced the emperor to abandon it. Henry then used his military advantage to impose a second settlement that restored the emperor's right of investiture. It looked like a decisive imperial victory, but it also revived the old fractures of German politics. Princes, both lay and clerical, wanted a ruler who would secure their position without limiting their independence. Opposition gathered again among territorial nobles, while the emperor found his most reliable backing in the urban and industrial communities along the Rhine. The settlement reached at Worms closed the opening act of the long struggle between spiritual authority and royal power. In that first phase, the German monarchy, first under Henry IV and then under Henry V, had been the one force able to slow down a program that pointed towards something much larger than church reform. Behind the arguments about bishops and ceremonies stood a claim that, if fully accepted, would place every secular ruler under the direction of a centralized clerical system based in Rome. For a brief moment earlier in the conflict, a radical solution had seemed possible. Separate the religious and the political completely. Let rulers govern the earth while the church focused strictly on souls. The attempt collapsed almost immediately, because it ignored how medieval society actually worked. Faith, law, family strategy Landholding, warfare, and legitimacy were woven together so tightly that cutting them apart was not a clean operation. The agreement at Worms did not untangle that knot. Instead, it admitted that the knot existed. A senior churchman would be treated as a figure with two public lives at once. One side of his authority, recognized by religious power, the other tied to the political world of offices, lands, and obligations. With that compromise on the table, European politics moved into a new stage where party lines harden and then keep reappearing in fresh forms. The rivalry between monarchy and territorial powers, already visible in the late Salian years and made clearer under Henry V, did not disappear. It became permanent. Over time, it collected names that would echo for generations. In the German lands, one label gathered the forces that resisted the policy later associated with the Hohenstaufen rulers, often clustering around a great noble house that became the natural rallying point for opposition. Another label came to mean loyalty to the older idea of kingship that reached back to Salian practice, adjusted to a changing world but still insisting that the realm was more than a loose coalition of princes. In Italy, those same names acquired additional meanings. One side aligned with the papacy, but also with the growing strength of city-based society, craftsmen, merchants, guild networks, and the politics that rose out of them. The other side became the banner for supporters of imperial authority in the peninsula and for older inherited interests that preferred the imperial idea as protection against both papal pressure and urban radicalism. The transformation becomes clearer when the map is imagined across 2.5 centuries. Around the year 1000, Central Europe was dominated by large territorial blocks: Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, Lorraine, each with its own sense of identity and a local aristocracy, eager to guard its autonomy. By the middle of the 13th century, those broad regions had been fragmented into a patchwork of smaller lordships. A new and often more disciplined aristocracy held these territories, no less jealous of privilege and usually better trained in extracting it. This change was driven largely by the spread of feudal habits of power. Step by step, rulers were forced to bargain away rights for money, troops, or political peace, especially whenever campaigns in Italy demanded resources the monarchy could not reliably raise on its own. Even more dramatic was the movement of the eastern frontier. Around 1000, the effective boundary ran along rivers and border marches, beyond which lay large Slav and Magyar populations, only loosely connected to German rule. By the middle of the 13th century, German settlement and influence had pushed deep into the Oder Basin and beyond, earlier lines along the Danube. Austria, once a border zone, had grown into a duchy with expanding reach, while northern expansion along the Baltic opened space for a strongly German cultural zone in lands that had previously been non-Christian and outside the old frontier. This was not only conquest or diplomacy, it was also migration, farming, town building, and the slow spread of institutions that followed settlers. The next task is to connect that expansion of population and production to high politics. Here, Italy returns as the critical problem. Communal independence in the peninsula, especially in Lombardy, had begun to show itself already in the era of Conrad II. Under Henry III, it was held in check because imperial resources were unusually strong. Under Henry IV, the cities sometimes offered support, but the Great Church conflict pulled many of them into the orbit of reformed politics. They helped raise an imperial prince when it suited them, then abandoned him when he no longer served their needs. By the time the Hohenstaufen came to the centre of the story, northern Italian city power had matured into a political force capable of balancing pope and emperor. While doing so, it drove a burst of cultural and economic energy that would shape Europe for centuries. The Hohenstaufen challenge was straightforward in outline and brutal in practice. The empire had to assert that its authority in Italy was real, not ceremonial, and it had to impose that claim not only with armies, but with law, especially the revived prestige of Roman legal thinking, which offered arguments for a single source of sovereignty and a single fountain of law. The Hohenstaufen era opens with an election that did not go the way the old imperial circle expected. Henry V left no children, but two close relatives, Conrad and Frederick of Swabia, had been his leading supporters and assumed they were next in line. Yet the princes moved cautiously, and the procedure showed a new level of organisation. Representatives from the main regional blocs were chosen to nominate candidates, and several names were put forward. In the end, the choice fell on Lothair of Saxony, supported by the coalition that favoured closer cooperation with the papacy. The Swabian brothers resisted, but most princes backed the Saxon candidate. Lothair's coronation came with a political bill attached. The price of clerical support was a new concession. The emperor loosened his grip on the process by which bishops were chosen, and accepted a rule that pushed him to recognise anyone who could demonstrate a valid election. In a major vacant see, he permitted the appointment of a reform-minded churchman closely tied to the Roman direction of the time. These choices signalled that the balance created at Worms could be interpreted in a way that strengthened papal influence without openly tearing up the settlement. At the same time, a dangerous ambiguity surfaced. What belonged to the ruler personally, and what belonged to the office he held? The Swabian princes claimed that as heirs of Henry V, they had a right not only to his private lands but also to territories acquired during his reign for the empire. In modern terms, the argument sounds absurd, yet it reveals how uncertain political ownership still was. Power was often treated as personal property. The state had weak institutional machinery. There could be long gaps when the imperial title was disputed or vacant. Even when people spoke of imperial possessions, it was not always clear who, exactly, embodied the empire and could legally receive the service of vassals and lands. This confusion made extreme claims possible, and made legal certainty rare. Lothair moved quickly to crush this challenge. A gathering of princes sided with him, declared the Swabians under the empire's ban, and treated them as enemies of public order. Then came a strategic marriage. Lothair bound his dynasty to a rising northern power by marrying his daughter to a leading Welf prince. That union created a territorial giant. Through inheritance and grants, the Welf position in Saxony became the base for a long-term power block in the north, later linked to wider European developments. The size and geography of these holdings made the Welf interest a natural rival to the Hohenstaufen vision and, by extension, a natural partner for papal strategy whenever Rome sought leverage inside Germany. The Swabian resistance did not collapse instantly. Conrad was even put forward as a rival king for a time, and there were armed demonstrations in Italy. The larger current favoured the Saxon-Guelph papal alignment. Lothair reached Rome and received imperial coronation from the reigning pope, after further bargaining. Questions that seemed settled returned immediately in new forms. When, exactly, should a bishop receive the rights of a temporal lord? What remained in imperial hands? What passed under papal influence? And how should disputed Italian lands be treated in a world where feudal language could be used to describe almost anything? In Tuscany, for example, arrangements were framed as if the region could be held for life under certain payments, and then revert, then be granted again, then revert again. Contracts that make sense only in a political culture where lordship was imagined as a layered set of personal ties, rather than a stable national sovereignty. By the mid-11th century, the pressure of the new northern power was so heavy that the Hohenstaufen princes chose reconciliation. They kept their family base and became supporters of the crown rather than open rebels. Soon after, Lothair turned south against the Norman kingdom in Sicily, a state with its own ambitions and a history of involvement in papal rivalries. The campaign looked like a crusade in tone, partly because the Sicilian rulers used a wide mix of subjects and soldiers, and governed with a hard practicality that alarmed neighbours. Lothair advanced with strong support, gathered funds from Lombard cities, pushed deep into southern Italy, and quickly controlled much of the mainland. The army refused to cross into Sicily, and the victory raised an awkward question. If the lands were, in feudal theory, tied to papal overlordship, who had the right to install the new ruler? The solution echoed the Worms Compromise. The symbol of political rule and the acknowledgement of higher authority were presented together, as if divided and unified at the same time. In practice, the conquest did not last. Within months, the Normans recovered what had been lost. The campaign's political harvest was thin. Far more lasting were the changes on Germany's northeastern edge. The reform appointment at Magdeburg became the starting point for an outward push that mixed missionary work with colonization. New monastic settlements were planted beyond the Elbe, not only as religious houses but as engines of agriculture and organization. Farmers and labourers moved into these zones from denser regions, and the commercial energy flowing from the west began to reach even these frontier lands. Town life took root, and new city communities appeared with surprising speed. Saxony, once viewed as backward compared with older centres, moved rapidly into a leading role. In that sense, Lothair's most enduring work was not in Rome or Apulia, but in the long-term construction of northern power. When Lothair died, it seemed logical that the vast Welf prince, his son-in-law, would inherit the crown. Yet German elections were often shaped by fear of allowing any single lord to become too dominant. A group of princes chose Conrad of Hohenstaufen instead. The decision hinted at something new. Not only rivalry between individuals, but rivalry between two recognizable political visions, each anchored in a family and able to survive across generations. One side aimed to protect the realm from being swallowed by a single overgrown territorial bloc. The other aimed to secure regional autonomy against a strong monarchy. The first major act of the new Hohenstaufen rule was to break the Welf territorial concentration. A decision declared that one prince should not hold multiple great duchies, and Saxony was reassigned to a different northern leader, Albert the Bear, whose earlier role on the Elbe marches foreshadowed the later rise of Brandenburg. Bavaria was also taken from the Welf and given to an Austrian relative of the king, reinforcing the growth of Austria as a southern counterweight. These moves changed offices more than private property. But in a world where offices brought real power, they were enormous blows. The Welf Duke died before he could mount a full response, leaving his young heir with a lifetime struggle ahead. By the early 1140s, the Hohenstaufen position looked secure. A general peace was proclaimed, and marriages braided rival houses together in an attempt to stabilise the realm. Observers close to the ruling family could even describe the moment as a final victory of church interest over imperial ambition. That confidence would not last. The relationship between papal policy, German factions, and dynastic strategy was too unstable to freeze in place. The next dramatic shift came through the Second Crusade. Preaching from the Reform movement carried crusading energy into Germany strongly enough to draw a Hohenstaufen king into an expedition that seemed, at first glance, more useful to papal prestige than to imperial policy. The journey east followed the familiar hard road through Hungary to Constantinople and then into Syria. The attack on Damascus ended in failure and disarray, damaging the reputation of the crusading enterprise and weakening the aura of papal leadership that had seemed so irresistible after the First Crusade. Chroniclers spoke of peace in Europe during the absence of so many warriors, but it proved temporary. Old disputes were merely paused, not resolved. As soon as the crusading wave receded, the Welf heir, now an adult, returned to the family program with renewed force. Titles and claims were recovered, though the old duchies no longer meant what they had once meant. Parts had been carved away and reorganized, and rival lords held territories directly under the crown, independent of ducal authority. In Bavaria especially, Austrian power continued to grow, limiting what the ducal title could actually command. When King Conrad died in 1152, his house was strong enough to secure the election of Frederick, later called Barbarossa. He was presented as a figure who might reconcile rival forces because his family ties connected him to both camps. Yet that hope was quickly disappointed. In Germany, the Hohenstaufen rivalry remained the central tension of his reign. For the larger European story, however, Frederick's real stage was Italy. With Barbarossa begins a renewed imperial attempt to make the empire's Roman inheritance feel real again. This time, the effort would not rely only on armies and symbolism. It would lean heavily on scholarship and legal tradition, especially the revived study of Roman law. The argument was ambitious. Imperial lands should recognize a single ultimate source of law and authority, and other political forms could exist only by imperial consent, and at a price. In Germany, this theory was easier to assert because the empire overlapped with a long-established kingship. In Italy, the ground was different. The kingdom there had never become a national institution. Earlier rulers, Lombards, Franks, and later claimants, had held titles without deep roots in a unified political community. Attempts by energetic Italians to build a real monarchy out of the peninsula's fragments had repeatedly failed because the principle of unity was missing. Even the Norman kingdom in the south, the one Italian power strong enough to attempt unification, chose a different path, strengthening itself and chasing ambitions overseas. The absence of a stable territorial monarchy in Italy was tied to economics. Germany's development was largely agricultural. Italy's remained heavily urban and industrial. The feudal system worked best in open countryside, where castles and rural lordship could enforce obedience through land control and armed retainers. In cities, that logic broke down. A count or bishop ruling inside a dense urban community faced pressures that a rural lord could avoid. Craftsmen and merchants lived close together, exchanged ideas quickly, formed collective identities, and learned to organize. When urban populations became determined, a city lord could not easily reduce them to permanent submission, and in northern Italy the idea of turning large city populations into slaves was simply unrealistic. Northern Italy's city politics had already been shaped by the earlier church conflicts. Struggles against episcopal rule taught a decisive lesson. United citizens could beat powers that looked overwhelming on paper. Repeated confrontations demanded leadership, strategy, discipline, and sacrifice, and those habits produced political competence. By Barbarossa's time, Lombardy had undergone something close to a revolution. Episcopal administration had been pushed aside across many cities, replaced by forms of civic government that feel strikingly modern compared with the surrounding feudal world. The term often used for these governments did not imply equal ownership of wealth. It simply meant the city acting as a corporate body, like a single legal person. The change did not happen overnight. It moved through stages: conflict, negotiation, compromise, and formal recognition, sometimes advancing quickly, sometimes pausing, but always trending toward greater autonomy. The earliest phase is visible in the era when religious reform sparked political confrontation. City communities began negotiating not only with bishops, but also with noble families above and below them, learning to play power against power and to speak the language of rights. That training, gained in the heat of moral conflict, would soon face a new challenge: an emperor determined to rebuild imperial control in Italy using both soldiers and law. By the early 12th century, many northern Italian cities had pushed the bishop out of the driver's seat, either stripping him of real authority or boxing him in behind new civic institutions that could speak and act for the community. Power did not vanish into chaos. It was reorganized. At the top stood a small executive group commonly known as consuls. In some places there were only two. In others, there could be many more, drawn from the most influential households and commercial circles. They served for short terms, typically a single year, and handled the daily business of governing. Diplomacy, justice, public order, and the management of resources. Variations of these officers had existed earlier in scattered form, but the turning point came around the end of the 11th century and the opening decades of the 12th, when this consular style became a normal feature across Lombardy. These executives were never meant to rule alone. Around them grew broader bodies that limited and supervised their actions. At first, there could be an assembly of citizens, a general gathering that carried echoes of older traditions, both classical and Germanic. Over time, as cities grew and politics became more complex, this mass meeting lost practical influence. It did not disappear, but it was increasingly replaced by councils that could meet more regularly and make decisions more efficiently. A large council emerged as the most durable institution, representing the civic body in a more organized form. From within that larger group, narrower committees formed, often reflecting differences in wealth and status. One council tended to mirror the wider citizenry. Another leaned toward the urban elite, and in many cities an even tighter inner circle appeared. A small decision-making ring that could act quickly in moments of crisis. The pattern was familiar. Even where a city insisted it was broad-based and public-spirited, political gravity pulled influence toward a smaller group that had time, money, connections, and experience. Yet the urban majority that powered this system, merchants, craftsmen, guild networks, and the dense neighborhoods of producers, could not simply ignore the landholding class around them. Lombardy was not only streets, workshops, and markets. Beyond the walls, and sometimes within them, stood an older aristocratic world. Families with rural estates, private fortresses, armed followings, and habits formed in a feudal landscape. Those landowners faced a choice. They could resist the city's rise, treat the new commercial order as a threat, and ally with forces that wanted to keep trade and urban autonomy under control. Or they could accept that the city was becoming the engine of wealth and security, and try to ride that wave from the inside. The second path, after bitter friction, proved to be the more intelligent and more profitable one in many places. Over time, a great deal of the landed nobility made peace with the communes, entered civic life, took up citizenship, and, using wealth, military usefulness, and administrative skill, often climbed into leadership positions. The result was not a pure people versus nobles story. It became a blended ruling class, still tense and competitive, but capable of operating inside the civic framework rather than trying to smash it from outside. By the age of Frederick Barbarossa, this political machinery was largely in place across the Lombard plain. Many cities had reached something close to a republican constitution, even if each city's version looked slightly different and remained subject to sudden upheavals. They were solving their own problems within their own walls, but the longer the process continued, the clearer it became that no city could act as if it lived alone. Small communities discovered that autonomy was fragile without protection. The weaker the city, the more it needed the backing of a stronger neighbour when wars, trade disputes, or border raids threatened survival. That need created a second layer of politics: networks of dependency. Major cities, Milan, Pavia, Ravenna, and others, could present themselves as protectors, but protection often came with strings attached. Smaller places might gain security and leverage, yet pay for it through obedience, tribute, or political submission. In this environment, dominance was rarely gentle. Milan's conduct in particular became a symbol of how difficult the balance could be. Neighbouring towns needed Milan's muscle, but they also experienced its leadership as heavy-handed, sometimes humiliating, and at moments unbearable. Dependence could flip quickly into revolt. The most common spark for clashes between cities was the unresolved question of how they stood in relation to the empire. In theory, there remained an overarching imperial authority above the Italian political landscape. In practice, long stretches passed when that authority was distant, distracted, or absent. During those gaps, especially in periods when the imperial title was contested, or the ruler could not enforce his will in Italy, the communes grew with minimal interference. Even in the decades of the Great Church struggle, the cities were too valuable as allies for any side to alienate through constant pressure. During those years, nobody needed to deny the emperor's senior status in principle. The idea could even be useful. A city might invoke imperial overlordship as a shield against a rival, or one faction might appeal to the emperor against another. It was a flexible fiction that different players could pull off the shelf when convenient. The trouble began when the cities developed a stronger sense of collective identity and shared interests than the old umbrella theory could comfortably contain. Once a commune believed it held its rights by the strength of its own civic body, imperial claims stopped feeling like harmless tradition and started sounding like intrusion. That new confidence was strengthened by an intellectual change that quietly reshaped the political world: the revival of legal study. Roman law had not vanished from Italy. Elements of it survived in practice, living alongside the customs of later conquerors and local traditions. What had faded was systematic teaching, law as a disciplined field, argued from texts, principles, and definitions. Medieval society often treated law as inherited habit, something absorbed by belonging to a community, rather than learned in classrooms. But toward the end of the 11th century, a reaction set in. Written codes gained renewed relevance, and the needs of the rising communes made that relevance urgent. Cities were creating offices, negotiating treaties, regulating trade, defending jurisdiction, and organizing courts. They required sharper tools than inherited custom alone could provide. In that context, the structured study of Roman legal texts became a practical weapon as much as an academic pursuit. Bologna became the most famous centre of this movement, first through independent masters, then as a magnet for students, a place where a new kind of expertise could be acquired. The impact ran deep. Legal education offered an alternative path into public life for men who would otherwise have had few routes upward except through church careers. More importantly, it trained people to argue about rights in a new way. Claims were no longer supported only by memory, tradition, or sacred authority. They increasingly relied on reasoning, definitions, precedents, and the language of jurisdiction. As the habit spread, lay specialists began to appear in the councils of rulers and princes, gradually taking roles once dominated by clerics. This mattered because Roman law was born from a highly centralized state, and from the logic of city governance extended over a vast territory. Its ideas naturally appealed to an age in which princes were trying to tighten control over restless vassals, and in which cities were seeking to escape older forms of feudal supervision. The change did not instantly remake Europe, but it altered the terrain of debate. Politics became more argumentative, more technical, and more self-conscious. That shift arrived at the worst possible moment for peaceful coexistence in northern Italy. Earlier emperors had relied on Lombard cities when facing papal pressure, often tolerating their independence because they needed their support. The Hohenstaufen came to power with a sharper sense of imperial entitlement at the very time the communes were most aware of their own strength. The new imperial policy aimed to revive ancient prerogatives, authority as a judge above all Italian powers, fiscal rights, oversight of public order, and the expectation of obedience, just as the cities were least inclined to accept new demands. Conflict was not a possibility. It was built into the timing. From the opening years of Barbarossa's reign until a final settlement decades later, northern Italy became the arena of a generational struggle. It would not be a simple duel of emperor versus city. It would tangle with church politics, local rivalries, and shifting alliances. The first signs appeared immediately in Frederick's initial descent into Italy. On a broad plain near Piacenza, an imperial assembly gathered in the old style. Delegations came from across the peninsula, bringing petitions and accusations as if appealing to a supreme court. Cities used the occasion to denounce one another. Broken agreements, raids, disputed boundaries, and violence dressed up as justice. Frederick listened, judged, and chose sides, aligning himself with some and moving against others. His action against a resisting neighbour of an imperial ally was meant as a demonstration. The destruction of that city sent a shock through the region. It was not simply punishment. It was a warning that imperial authority was returning in a more muscular form than Italy had seen for generations. Even Milan, accustomed to acting like a regional power, was forced to reassess. Conciliation suddenly looked wiser than defiance, at least for the moment. The message was clear. The empire intended to speak again, and it intended to be obeyed. As Frederick approached Rome, another set of tensions came into view. Older, more volatile, and charged with symbolism. The Pope at the time was a figure of discipline and will, ready to defend strong claims for the papacy. Yet the city he ruled locally was in revolt against the very idea of being governed as a papal possession. A democratic surge, already visible in Tuscany and northern communes, had reached Rome and found fuel in the city's obsession with its own past. Memories of the ancient republic were a powerful tool. The weaker the real link to that past, the easier it was to romanticize it, and the more intensely it could be used to rally crowds. Rome shared certain features with Lombard cities. Its executive head was also a bishop. Its elite classes could be divided into higher and lower nobles. It had guilds, trades, and a restless populace capable of sudden political clarity. It also stood at the centre of a wider district of dependent towns and tried to turn influence into control. But the similarities ended quickly. The Bishop of Rome carried a global role as leader of Western Christianity, and that universal position often pulled attention away from local governance. Rome's nobility lacked the steady civic pragmatism that had led many Lombard nobles to join communal life. And the Roman urban population, famous for quick enthusiasms and quicker disappointments, had not developed the disciplined persistence found in some northern cities. Pride in ancient titles and institutions could coexist with corruption, faction, and political volatility. A local war in the early 1140s reveals the dynamic. Rome fought a nearby town in the same aggressive spirit seen elsewhere in Italy, treating it as a test of honour and dominance. The papacy, however, preferred compromise, and the Pope of that moment secured a settlement that seemed to favour Rome's opponent. That decision triggered a familiar reaction: resentment at papal interference and a surge of local nationalism. The population drove its bishop out, then moved beyond protest into construction. A communal government was organised in conscious imitation of northern models, but with deliberate gestures toward ancient Roman imagery, where possible. At the centre of this revolution stood a revived Senate. The name had never entirely disappeared from medieval memory, but now it was given a concrete form, representatives linked to districts, acting as the supreme civic authority. Alongside it appeared a new executive title meant to sound ancient and sovereign, replacing earlier offices associated with papal control. The city also organised a militia under communal direction. For a moment, the symbolism and the machinery seemed to match. Rome was presenting itself not as a mere city like Milan, but as the natural capital of the world, reclaiming a political inheritance that had once ruled empires. Into this atmosphere arrived a figure whose reputation would become fused with the movement. A reform-minded cleric from Lombardy, shaped by the civic conflicts of the north and sharpened by exposure to the new intellectual currents of his age. He was not simply repeating older calls for stricter discipline. Earlier reform had often pursued purity by strengthening institutions, more monastic rigour to cleanse monasteries, more clerical authority to cleanse the clergy. This new voice argued the opposite, that the Church's moral failures were tied to worldly possessions and political power, and that the cleanest cure would be to separate spiritual life from temporal rule. It was a dangerous idea because it cut under the foundations of both episcopal lordship and papal government. The reformer's strength was not subtle scholarship but public persuasion. He spoke in clear, forceful terms that could turn religious critique into political energy. That made him useful to a Roman commune that needed not only institutions but justification, an argument that could defend rebellion as righteousness. Under these pressures, the Pope of the time found Rome nearly impossible to govern directly. Much of his pontificate was spent away from the city, negotiating from nearby strongholds or travelling beyond Italy, trying to enforce obedience with moral authority when he could not command it with local power. Success, however, bred overconfidence among the Romans. They began to speak as if restoring a city, government meant restoring world rule. Messages were sent to the German king, inviting him to come to Rome and receive the imperial crown as if it were the gift of the Roman people alone. The letters promised a revived capital and a chance to reign like the great rulers of antiquity. Now that the city had supposedly cleared away the obstacles that had hindered earlier emperors. It was a grand invitation, heavy with nostalgia and theatrical confidence. Yet the German ruler did not take the bait. He understood that the Roman commune's claims were more performance than stable power, and that Italy's realities were not reshaped by slogans and antique titles. He stayed away, never received the imperial coronation, and left Rome's revolutionary experiment to collide, soon enough, with the returning weight of imperial ambition under Barbarossa. When Frederick finally reached the outskirts of Rome, he found a city that had spent a full decade practicing self-rule and growing bolder, with every year it survived. The communal government no longer spoke like a nervous experiment, begging to be tolerated. It spoke like a restored power. Representatives came out to greet the emperor with polished ceremony and carefully chosen words, praising the rebirth of Rome's ancient greatness and presenting the commune as the living heir of that prestige. Then came the condition. The city would recognize Frederick as its military arm and executive protector, but only if he paid a large sum, confirmed their old privileges, and sealed the whole arrangement in writing with a sworn pledge. It was an offer shaped like loyalty, yet it sounded like a contract imposed on a ruler before he had even entered the city. Frederick's response, stripped of dramatic flourishes, revealed the real collision of principles. He refused to treat Rome's new Senate and civic titles as the source of imperial legitimacy. In his view, the emperor did not receive authority as a favour granted by a municipal assembly, nor did he arrive as a hired agent. He had marched into Italy with an army, not to purchase permission to rule, but to enforce an older claim of sovereignty that did not depend on Rome's current mood. The communes' attempt to bargain made clear how far the city had drifted from the political realities of the age. It spoke the language of ancient sovereignty, but it needed protection like any other vulnerable power. Frederick understood that accepting their terms would mean admitting that his crown was essentially a Roman civic grant, and he would not make that concession. Like the German ruler before him, he chose not to validate what he saw as a stage-set republic using antique symbols to disguise its weakness. Instead, he turned to the one authority in Rome that could still offer a workable partnership: the papacy. The Pope, at that moment, had every reason to negotiate. Restoring papal control over the city mattered more than defending the commune's pride, and the arrival of German force looked like a lifeline. The coronation took place at St. Peter's, but even that ceremony showed how unstable the situation remained. The route into the city proper was contested, and fighting erupted around the river crossing. Only after a determined struggle did Emperor and Pope manage to secure access and move with any confidence inside Rome. With the old order temporarily reinstalled by foreign arms, the papal government demanded a price. The reform preacher who had helped give the Roman movement its ideological bite was seized near the city and delivered into papal hands. He was condemned as a heretic and executed under the revived papal administration. It was not simply the removal of an inconvenient speaker. It was a message. Once again, church authority and imperial power appeared together, and once again the target was a figure who had challenged the fusion of spiritual office with worldly control. This pattern would repeat in later centuries whenever the two highest institutions found it useful to crush a dissenting movement. Cooperation at the summit, severity directed downward, and a public punishment meant to discourage imitation. The alliance, however, was never as stable as it looked in the glow of ritual and victory. The Pope still could not hold Rome securely for long, and Frederick's priorities lay elsewhere. The emperor had pressing business in northern Italy, where the city communes were growing stronger, richer, and more confident each year. The brief harmony between imperial and papal interests was quickly broken by the reappearance of the same unresolved question that had haunted earlier generations: who stood above whom, and by what right? A minor diplomatic incident ignited the conflict. Papal envoys delivered a message that included a word carrying two meanings: one harmless, one explosive. It could mean a favour granted, but it could also suggest a feudal grant, implying that the empire itself was held as a dependency from the Pope. Frederick's supporters reacted instantly. Tempers flared, voices rose, and the atmosphere turned dangerous. The papal representatives responded in a way that only deepened suspicion, implying that the imperial title depended on papal bestowal. Whether the Pope intended to push the claim that far or not, Frederick heard the insult clearly, a hint that the emperor was, in essence, a papal vassal. For a ruler determined to revive imperial authority, that suggestion could not be allowed to stand. At the same time, Another conflict was ripening in Lombardy. The emperor wanted his rights in Italy defined not as vague tradition, but as a legal system, written down and enforceable. He summoned a major assembly on the plain, near Piacenza, announcing his intention to clarify the laws of his realms and fix them in written form. The timing was deliberate. Milan had already shown that agreements meant little when power shifted, and Frederick had been forced to pressure the city militarily into a temporary peace. He now aimed to do something more permanent, define exactly what the empire could demand from the communes. The work was handed to leading legal specialists from the Italian law schools, men trained in the revived methods of Roman legal reasoning. Representatives from the cities were also involved, but the direction of the inquiry favoured the emperor. The central question was the scope of the emperor's reserved rights, those claims inherited, in his view, from earlier kings of Italy. A detailed list was drawn up. Tolls, fines, confiscations, burdens placed on trade routes, and a heavy obligation to sustain the emperor and his forces whenever he appeared in the region. The most sensitive point concerned local government. The emperor asserted the right to shape the appointment of key officials, even if the commune's consent was still formally acknowledged. On paper, the cities recognised these demands. In reality, the list amounted to a reversal of much of what the communes had achieved through decades of struggle. It was difficult to imagine them accepting such limits, once the decree was tested by daily administration. Up to that moment, Frederick had still maintained the appearance of workable relations with the Pope. But the new legal definition of imperial rights was not aimed only at Lombardy. It applied to all territories considered part of the imperial sphere, and that included lands the papacy treated as its own. The Pope could not ignore what was being implied. If the emperor's rights were defined in sweeping terms, then papal claims to independent temporal rule were automatically threatened. The papacy, therefore, drifted toward the Lombard cities, not because it had become sympathetic to urban democracy, but because it needed allies against a revived imperial program. The Pope answered Frederick's legal language with legal language of his own, restating older principles about papal supremacy and reinforcing them with increasingly sophisticated appeals to tradition and doctrine. Frederick replied in the same elevated style, presenting the empire as a continuation of Roman authority, reshaped by centuries of Frankish dominance and German kingship. The debate among lawyers sounded abstract, but behind it stood armies, taxes, sieges, and political survival. The struggle intensified rather than cooled. The Pope died in the middle of the confrontation, and his successor was a determined opponent of imperial pressure. Under him, resistance hardened into a long-term campaign. For more than 2 decades, the papacy became the organizing center of opposition to the Hohenstaufen vision, enduring years of division and rival claimants, while refusing to yield. The alliance between Rome and the Lombard communes was practical, not sentimental. Papal rule over its own cities could be harsh and controlling, just like imperial rule. Yet, when confronted by a stronger threat, the papacy did what it had often done in European politics. It partnered with forces it did not fully trust, because they were useful at the moment. The real test came when imperial policy moved from declarations to enforcement. Frederick tried to implement the clause that allowed him to shape or nominate municipal officials. Smaller towns, often intimidated by their stronger neighbours, sometimes accepted imperial supervision, half relieved to have an outside counterweight against Milan's dominance. Milan refused. It claimed earlier agreements outweighed the new legal settlement and treated imperial intervention as an attack on civic freedom. Moderates urged restraint, but the political energy of the city pushed toward open defiance. Imperial officials were expelled. Preparations were made for siege. Frederick concluded that law alone would not decide the issue. He raised funds, exploited rivalries among the cities, assembled a large force, and tightened the noose around Milan. The siege became a test of endurance and identity. Milan resisted not merely to save its walls, but to defend the principle that its government could not be appointed from outside. Hunger did what weapons could not. After prolonged suffering and negotiations, the city surrendered. The punishment was designed to make future resistance impossible. Milan's buildings were torn down, its defences levelled, much of its civic life scattered. Churches and a few public structures were spared, but the goal was humiliation and disablement rather than massacre. Neighbouring towns that had long chafed under Milan's dominance took part in the destruction with the enthusiasm of revenge. Some later stories describe symbolic acts of total ruin, but the more important reality was political. Milan was meant to be erased as a leader. The apparent victory quickly proved short-sighted. Milan had been oppressive at times, but it had also served as a shield for the wider communal movement. With Milan crippled, the imperial administration no longer feared resistance and revealed its true character in Lombardy. Heavy exactions, relentless demands, and an approach aimed at breaking the spirit that made the communes prosperous and self-governing. The smaller cities which had celebrated Milan's fall began to understand what they had helped unleash. Discontent spread, and papal agents skilled in turning frustration into coalition fed it carefully, linking the cause of the communes to the cause of the Pope, who was himself under pressure from imperial policy. Within a few years, the cities turned toward a solution they had previously avoided: federation. Earlier, each town had fought for itself. Now, experience taught a harder lesson. Security could not be maintained in isolation. Quiet meetings brought city leaders together in secrecy. What began as mutual defense started to grow into a political structure. One of the earliest and most revealing decisions was the agreement to rebuild Milan. That was more than charity. It was an admission that Milan's survival mattered to everyone. The speed of Milan's return showed that its destruction had not extinguished its capacity, and it also showed how quickly civic energy could reappear when people believed their future depended on it. As more cities joined, the alliance became more sophisticated. Membership was negotiated through practical terms designed to protect each city's autonomy while binding it to a collective purpose. Trade privileges were debated alongside military obligations. Rules were created for compensation after raids and for shared responsibility in emergencies. River crossings, toll exemptions, and mutual repair of damages became part of the political language. These details might look small compared with royal drama, yet they reveal something larger taking shape: the early habits of intercity cooperation, reciprocity, and a rough sense of shared legal expectation between distinct political units. The alliance spread and deepened. Parallel groupings formed in other regions, connecting maritime and inland powers with neighbouring towns. To Frederick, all of this was rebellion and oath-breaking. He responded with bans and preparations for war. The cities replied by widening coordination and creating common rules for collective defence. A key step was the formation of a federal executive committee, chosen from the leading officials of member cities, empowered to act beyond the slow rhythms of separate councils. The League was still fragile. Old grudges did not vanish, and each city remained jealous of its rights. But the fact that the coalition endured at all under pressure showed how strong the communal instinct had become. The League also made a strategic decision that turned symbolism into geography. Near hostile territory, it founded a new fortified city at remarkable speed, laying out walls, streets, and temporary housing for defenders and settlers. The place drew colonists, many from imperial lands, and it was named to honour the Pope, signalling openly that the communal cause and the papal cause were now intertwined. The city's very existence was a challenge. A fortress built by coalition, planted in a sensitive corridor, intended to block imperial movement and serve as a rallying point. Frederick returned after years of building strength in Germany, determined to crush the alliance. He aimed first at the new fortress city, investing it with a stubborn, personal intensity that marked his campaigns. For months, the defenders held out with minimal help, proving that the League's strategy had been sound. Eventually, the Allied cities assembled a relief force and arrived ready for battle. Yet even then, they leaned toward negotiation. They were fighting to preserve liberties, not for conquest, and they offered recognition of imperial sovereignty if their rights could be settled by a binding commission. It was a last attempt to keep the conflict within diplomatic boundaries. That effort failed for the simplest reason. The core demands were incompatible. The communes needed guarantees that would protect their self-rule. The emperor could not accept those guarantees without surrendering the very claim he had come to enforce. The papacy, with its own interests, had no desire to see a compromise that strengthened imperial authority. Skirmishes resumed. The cities renewed oaths publicly, turning League membership into a shared civic faith. Frederick, in turn, struggled to gather enough support from his vassals, a problem that revealed the limits of medieval monarchy. The dramatic stories of emperors pleading with powerful princes reflect a real dependency. Kings could command only as far as their followers found it useful to obey. When Frederick crossed the Alps for the decisive effort, his force was far smaller than the grand armies of earlier campaigns. He aimed directly at Milan, the symbol and engine of the League. The Allied cities were ready. The confrontation came on the plain north of Milan. At first, the Imperial knights struck hard, scattering the Lombard cavalry. Then, the battle tightened around the communal standard and the infantry that refused to break. The city soldiers held their ground, absorbed repeated attacks, and gradually threw the Imperial forces into disorder. By evening, the Emperor ordered retreat, which turned into a rout. For hours he vanished from sight, and rumours spread that he had been killed until he reappeared with a small escort in his loyal stronghold. This clash mattered because it was not simply a raid or a feud. It was a rare medieval battle fought over competing political visions. Centralized imperial authority, grounded in legal tradition, versus communal self-government, defended as a lived right. It had been approached through years of negotiation, compromise and sacrifice, and it ended with a result that could not be ignored. The League, led again by Milan, refused to accept half measures. The Emperor recognized he needed to separate his enemies. He moved toward reconciliation with the papacy, because peace with Rome offered the only way to reduce the coalition against him. A major diplomatic conference was arranged in a maritime city that could host both powers with safety and prestige. The Pope arrived first and managed the process with careful advantage. The Emperor waited outside until the ground was prepared for his entry, and the final agreement favoured the papacy. The Pope had survived decades of struggle against rival claimants and had built strong support across northern Europe. The communes, fresh from victory, demanded security for their autonomy. Frederick's priority was to end isolation and prevent a unified front of enemies, even if it meant conceding ground. Beneath the ceremony, the settlement marked a shift. The empire's theoretical claims remained grand, but Italian political reality had become too strong to be governed by theory alone. The most immediate beneficiaries were the Lombard cities, who gained a long truce while details were left for later settlement. Frederick used the breathing space to address problems in Germany. especially the challenge posed by a powerful duke whose vast holdings made him a rival rather than a subordinate. With the support of other princes who envied that concentration of power, the emperor moved against him through repeated summons and legal condemnation, then exile. Publicly, it looked like a victory for central authority. In practice, it reflected the interests of many princes using the emperor as an instrument to break a single, overgrown competitor. The duchies were fragmented and redistributed. Large territorial units shrank. A new political landscape emerged. Not great tribal duchies, but a patchwork of personal holdings and competing lords. The king's strength depended less on permanent institutions and more on his ability to buy loyalty through concessions and rewards. That weakness became visible again when the Lombard truce expired. After the fall of his German rival, Frederick might have tried to punish the Italian cities with a renewed campaign. Instead, he negotiated. The result was a landmark peace agreement that formally reaffirmed imperial overlordship while, in practical terms, recognizing the communes as self-governing. Cities that had long chosen their own officials could continue to do so. Payments to the emperor were regulated, rather than left to arbitrary exaction. Local administration was largely secured, with only limited channels left for imperial appeal in major legal disputes. On the surface, monarchy still shone with feudal splendor, grand assemblies, tournaments, ceremony, and declarations of unity. But the cost of that splendor was clear. In both Germany and Italy, royal power survived by granting away the very instruments that would have made it an effective state. At the height of his prestige, the emperor staged a magnificent gathering in Germany, a festival of chivalry, literature, devotion, and public loyalty. Even the response to his call for a crusade showed that the people who resisted Italian campaigns were not simply unwilling to fight. They resisted because Italy was politically costly and offered little shared purpose, while an expedition to the east could be framed as a universal cause. The final arc of Frederick's career would end far from Germany, and his death would belong to the story of crusading rather than to the administration of empire. Yet the broader meaning of his reign becomes clearest in comparison with Western monarchies that were developing different solutions. The medieval imperial experiment reached its most dramatic height under him, and at the same time revealed the limits that would shape the future of Europe. After the death of Frederick Barbarossa, the balance of power in Europe shifted noticeably in favour of the papacy. The Roman Church had successfully aligned itself with the strongest political and social forces shaping the future. It had emerged from its long struggle with the empire in a position of clear advantage, securing the outcomes that mattered most for its authority. By placing itself at the forefront of the crusading movement, it captured the imagination of a deeply religious age that responded strongly to ideals of sacred warfare and spiritual mission. At the same time, the Church was preparing to confront and eliminate religious dissent within Europe, which it increasingly viewed as a serious threat to its universal authority. This period of papal strength is closely associated with the leadership of Innocent III, one of the most influential figures ever to occupy the papal throne. Yet before examining his rule, it is necessary to observe one final attempt by the empire to establish lasting control over Italy. Earlier agreements had preserved the emperor's theoretical supremacy in the peninsula, but they had also guaranteed such extensive freedoms to local authorities that imperial authority existed largely in name. The emperor's position in Italy had always suffered from a fundamental weakness. Unlike in Germany, where loyalty to royal tradition helped sustain his power, he possessed very little land that he could claim directly as his own. Without a strong territorial base, imperial claims lacked practical force. A possible solution appeared when the inheritance of the Kingdom of Naples and Sicily, passed into the hands of a single female heir. This development offered the imperial house a rare opportunity. The future Emperor Henry, son of Frederick Barbarossa, had already married Constance, a princess of the Norman royal family. When the reigning king died, without heirs, she became the rightful successor. Henry quickly moved to assert his claim, leading an army into southern Italy and seizing the crown by force. His imperial title did not strengthen this claim, since the Norman kingdom had never truly recognized imperial authority. Its political system had developed along different lines, and its people remained fiercely loyal to their own dynasty while deeply suspicious of foreign rule. Resistance quickly emerged under a rival claimant who represented native opposition to German control. Only after years of bitter warfare did Henry succeed in securing the throne. At the moment of his triumph in Sicily, his wife gave birth to a son who would later become one of the most remarkable rulers of the Middle Ages. The strategic aim behind this conquest had been clear. If the empire controlled territories both north and south of the papal lands, the papacy would be surrounded and forced to accept imperial supremacy. This vision of a unified political order, dominated by the emperor, appeared close to realization. Yet unforeseen events disrupted the plan. Henry died only a few years after securing his new kingdom, leaving behind a legacy of resentment among his southern subjects, who saw him as a harsh foreign conqueror. Shortly afterward, the papacy itself passed into the hands of a leader uniquely capable of turning circumstances to its advantage. When Innocent III became pope, conditions seemed more favourable to papal authority than at any previous moment. Earlier compromises between empire and church had not seriously weakened papal influence. Respect for the papacy was widespread across Europe, and its claims had become deeply embedded in religious thought. Its support of popular movements and its leadership of the Crusades had strengthened its political influence, while the dominant intellectual traditions of the age provided powerful theoretical justifications for its authority. The papacy was no longer merely a religious institution. It was becoming a central force in European politics. In Italy, the central driving force in political life had become the growing independence of the cities. Each sought to preserve as much autonomy as possible. Imperial officials appointed during Henry's rule had attempted to restore feudal control over many regions, placing heavy burdens on local populations. Even in Lombardy, where cooperation among the cities had once produced a strong sense of unity, rivalry and suspicion remained constant obstacles. Innocent recognized an opportunity in this situation. He encouraged resistance to imperial authority, presenting himself as a defender of Italian freedom against foreign domination. By appealing to widespread dissatisfaction and promising protection, he gradually succeeded in removing German control from much of central Italy and replacing it with papal influence. Through these efforts, Innocent effectively laid the foundations of a territorial papal state. For the first time in centuries, papal claims to direct political sovereignty approached full realization. Several cities in Tuscany formed alliances that expressed loyalty to the Pope and rejected imperial officials. Although the strongest urban centres preserved their independence, other regions accepted papal authority. In territories stretching across central Italy, imperial structures collapsed, and papal protection took their place. Agreements with rival rulers confirmed these arrangements, granting the Pope control over extensive lands and establishing a political domain that would endure for generations. This expansion of papal territory also served as a counterbalance to the union of imperial and southern Italian power. Additional security seemed possible when the widow of Henry entrusted her young son's future to papal protection. Before her death, she reaffirmed the kingdom's subordinate relationship to the papacy and appointed the Pope as guardian of the child who represented the continuation of imperial ambitions. Despite the long-standing hostility between the papacy and the imperial house, Innocent carried out this responsibility with apparent sincerity. He believed that strong papal control in central Italy would prevent any dangerous concentration of power in the north and south of the peninsula. Meanwhile, events in Germany created further complications. After Henry's death, the German princes refused to accept a child ruler, fearing the instability that minority rule might bring. They had previously rejected attempts to make the empire hereditary, insisting that only an elective monarchy could protect them from tyranny. Although the young heir had been formally recognised, the princes declined to place him on the throne. Instead, they persuaded his uncle Philip to accept election as king. His support came largely from those who feared the growing influence of rival noble families. A competing faction soon emerged. A group of princes led by a powerful archbishop promoted another candidate, Otto of Brunswick, who belonged to a rival political house and enjoyed strong connections with England. This dispute between two German claimants quickly expanded into a wider European conflict. Foreign rulers saw opportunities to advance their own interests by supporting one side or the other. Alliances formed across national boundaries, transforming a succession dispute into a broader political struggle. Papal support became a decisive factor. Innocent carefully examined the claims of each candidate and justified his decision through elaborate reasoning. He rejected the young heir on technical grounds and dismissed the claims of Philip, arguing that his character and circumstances made him unsuitable. Otto, though supported by fewer princes, appeared more favourable to papal interests and was therefore recognised. The decision revealed the underlying principle guiding papal policy. The Pope would support the ruler, most likely to advance the Church's authority. Despite papal backing, the conflict in Germany continued. Philip eventually gained widespread recognition before his sudden assassination ended his cause. Otto then secured the throne without serious opposition, attempting to unite rival factions through marriage alliances. Yet political divisions proved too deep to overcome. Germany, exhausted by years of conflict, accepted his rule without enthusiasm. Meanwhile, in southern Italy, the young Frederick grew to maturity in a cultural environment unlike any other in Europe. Sicily exposed him to diverse traditions, languages, and intellectual influences. Poetry, philosophy, and new forms of artistic expression flourished around him, shaping a personality of remarkable energy and originality. By the time he reached adulthood, he had gained a reputation for exceptional ability and ambition. Eventually, dissatisfaction with Otto's rule led German princes to invite Frederick to claim the crown. Encouraged by the possibility of uniting imperial authority with his southern kingdom, he accepted the challenge despite the risks. Travelling with only a small following, he gradually gathered support across Germany, strengthened by alliances with powerful rulers and by papal approval. His rise culminated in a decisive victory over Otto's supporters, aided by a major international conflict that reshaped the balance of power in Europe. The turning point came with a great battle in northern France, where opposing coalitions clashed in a struggle that displayed early signs of national warfare. Armies, composed of both feudal knights and urban militias, fought with unprecedented scale and organisation. The victory strengthened centralized monarchy and demonstrated the growing power of unified states over traditional feudal alliances. Frederick's position in Germany was secured by these developments. His rival withdrew from public life, and imperial authority passed firmly into his hands. Yet his success owed much to papal support, and he soon faced demands to limit his power in Italy to protect papal interests. These tensions would shape the next phase of European politics. During the same period, the papacy also confronted powerful rulers in France and England. In France, the Pope intervened in a royal marriage dispute, asserting the Church's exclusive authority over such matters. When the king resisted, the Pope imposed severe religious sanctions on the entire kingdom. Religious life was suspended, public worship ceased, and the population faced immense spiritual pressure. Although resistance continued for some time, public opinion eventually forced the king to comply. In England, conflict arose over the appointment of a leading church official. The Pope insisted on his own candidate, while the king refused to accept external interference in national affairs. Once again, the papacy responded with sweeping sanctions, cutting off religious services throughout the country. Despite years of hardship, political opposition to the king remained limited, demonstrating both the strength of royal authority and the complex balance between national loyalty and religious power. These struggles revealed the extraordinary reach of papal influence at the height of its power. Through diplomacy, alliances, and spiritual authority, the papacy shaped the politics of Europe, confronting kings and emperors alike. Yet the same conflicts also exposed the limits of universal authority in a continent increasingly defined by emerging national identities and competing political ambitions. John eventually surrendered, and he did so in the most dramatic way possible. He accepted his crown as a kind of dependent holding from the Pope, placing the English kingdom under Roman overlordship in exchange for protection and legitimacy. That submission shocked many in England. It helped accelerate a new idea, that there were rights of the realm that stood apart from the king's personal will. Out of that pressure came the settlement associated with Magna Carta. Yet the most revealing twist came after the king gave Rome what it demanded. Once John had yielded, the Pope turned into his strongest ally, denouncing the barons as disloyal agitators simply because they refused to accept relentless and irregular financial demands. Medieval political logic could be strangely durable. The men who confronted the king did not make England's new dependency on the Holy See their main battlefield, and the annual payment that symbolized that relationship continued for generations before it was openly rejected much later, when critics finally treated it as intolerable. Beyond England and France, the same papal strategy spread across the smaller monarchies of Europe, often with even clearer results. On the Iberian Peninsula, Rome found repeated openings to interfere in the disputes of the Christian kingdoms that had formed as Muslim power slowly retreated southward. Kings and princes in Portugal, Leon, Castile, and Aragon were locked into constant warfare, shifting alliances and rival claims, and this instability created opportunities for an outside referee. One ruler went further than the rest, travelling to Rome in person and receiving his crown under papal authority, effectively making his kingship a papal-dependent grant. In the tangle of negotiations and conflicts among the Spanish states, the Pope repeatedly positioned himself as final judge. Spiritual pressure backed the policy. The threat was simple and blunt: comply or face condemnation. The same interventionist energy reached into Central and Eastern Europe as well, shaping disputes and successions in regions that stretched from Bohemia and Hungary toward the Adriatic coast, and even influencing politics in distant Christian borderlands further east. Taken together, these actions show the papacy operating according to a consistent governing concept. Rome's decisions were not driven by a neutral desire to uphold justice in every case, but by the practical needs of papal power. Moral language was used freely and at times sincerely, yet the pattern remained constant. The papacy chose the stance that strengthened its authority. Under this system, any ruler who tried to act as the independent manager of his own country's wealth and policy eventually collided with Rome. Allies of the Pope remained allies only as long as they were weak, dependent, or politically useful. The moment a sovereign tried to govern with full freedom, papal friendship became pressure and pressure became conflict. Kings such as those in England and France were drawn into this dynamic through domestic unrest as well. When public resistance rose against royal abuse, Rome could tighten the screws. When it wanted cooperation, it could ease the pressure. The deeper question facing Europe was how long emerging national communities could carry a political burden that treated sovereignty as conditional on papal approval. While Innocent's political reach expanded, another challenge grew inside European society itself. Across different regions, movements appeared that rejected parts of the dominant religious order. Some were accused of holding speculative beliefs about good and evil that clashed with orthodox teaching. Others were less concerned with abstract theology and more focused on how the Church actually lived. Its wealth, its hierarchy, and the distance between official religion and everyday moral life. These currents had surfaced earlier in scattered forms and under many names. They could be found in Italy among reform-minded urban groups, in northern Italy around earlier communal conflicts, and in parts of France where charismatic preachers called for a simpler faith. Suppression could be harsh, leaders could be executed, and yet the underlying discontent kept returning, growing quietly among ordinary people. Even modern observers struggle to map a neat family tree for these ideas, because sources are often written by enemies, and because local movements did not always share a single origin. One major strand emphasized personal devotion and the belief that a Christian life did not require a heavy institutional machine. A movement associated with a preacher from the region around Lyon developed this approach into a durable community. Its message was straightforward. Scripture contained enough guidance for believers, and the model of the early apostles was sufficient for the Church's basic life. Because reading the Bible mattered, translations of biblical texts began circulating outside official control. The strongest criticism targeted the clergy's wealth and behaviour, a complaint that was common at the time. But the decisive break came when these believers formed independent structures of preaching and discipline without the Church's permission. They did not build their identity around political rebellion. Many were peasants and artisans living in mountain regions, lacking powerful patrons. Yet the movement proved resilient, surviving waves of persecution and reappearing openly when later conditions allowed religious diversity to take root. Another challenge was different in character and far more alarming to Rome because it struck at the foundations of Christian teaching about God, creation, and salvation. In southern France, a dualist view of the universe spread widely, arguing that the existence of evil could not be explained under a single, all-powerful divine rule. The solution offered was stark. Two opposing powers governed reality. One, good and perfect, the other flawed and responsible for the material world's misery. From this flowed a set of conclusions that clashed directly with orthodox doctrine. The older Hebrew scriptures were rejected as the work of the lower power. Matter itself was treated as corrupt by nature, and human life became a struggle between spiritual longing and bodily limitation. Marriage was viewed with suspicion because it multiplied physical existence, and redemption was imagined as a long process of the soul shedding material bonds over time. The idea that God could truly become human was treated as impossible. Christ was described as appearing in form rather than fully sharing human nature, and sacramental teaching that involved material transformation was dismissed as crude and irrational. These teachings found their strongest footing in one of the most urbanized and commercially active regions in Europe. Towns in southern France were socially confident and intellectually quick, and many residents used these ideas as a protest against the moral emptiness they perceived in local religious life. In many places, there was no violent uprising. Instead, communities simply withdrew their loyalty from orthodox institutions. Local rulers often tolerated them, not seeing their beliefs as a threat to public order, and some even protected them. Under such conditions, the movement expanded rapidly, and in certain districts, the Church's normal tools of persuasion and discipline proved powerless. Reports from the time present a complicated picture of these believers. Enemies described them as dangerously deceptive. Supporters emphasized their seriousness and moral discipline. Predictably, rumors also circulated, stories of secret crimes and obscene rites. Such accusations were common in religious conflicts and often reveal more about fear and propaganda than about reality. What made these communities truly intolerable to Rome was not primarily their private morals, but their refusal to conform. In a system that linked salvation to obedience, public divergence itself was treated as a gateway to chaos. Non-compliance became the ultimate offense. Religious alarm was not the only force at work. Political opportunity shaped events just as powerfully. Northern and southern France remained culturally divided, and the great lord of the south held territories that looked tempting to both the French crown and ambitious northern nobles. If that regional power could be broken, the monarchy's reach would expand. A campaign in the south promised rich rewards and fewer risks than an expedition to the distant east. At the same time, crusading energy had begun to fade after recent disasters and disappointments overseas. A war closer to home, justified as a holy mission, could revive zeal while serving practical ambitions. Innocent did not rush immediately to armed force. At first, the papacy tried argument, preaching, and persuasion. Envoys were sent, local clergy were urged to act, and public debates were encouraged, yet toleration had already taken root in many communities. Local churchmen often hesitated to attack neighbours they knew personally, especially when those neighbours appeared honest and disciplined. Outside missionaries, largely from northern monastic circles, took over the work of persuasion. But the more debate continued, the more the movement spread. Rome interpreted this as proof of spiritual deception rather than as evidence that its methods were failing. The crisis escalated when a papal envoy was murdered, and suspicion fell on powerful southern leadership. Whether or not high-level complicity existed, the event shattered remaining restraint. After that, the papacy moved decisively. A crusade was proclaimed with the same spiritual rewards promised for campaigns in the Holy Land. Recruitment surged from across Europe, driven by piety, ambition, fear, greed, and the intoxicating sense that violence could be sanctified when authorized from above. The southern ruler at the center of suspicion attempted a last-minute submission, swearing obedience. But the machinery of war was already turning. The conflict quickly became a full-scale conquest. Major towns fell, fortresses were taken, and then the practical question emerged. Who would rule the captured lands? A northern noble with a reputation for ruthless determination rose as the leading military figure, combining sincere belief in the Crusade's purpose with a clear hunger for territorial power. From a strong base, he expanded control over vast parts of the south, while local rulers vacillated, sometimes resisting, sometimes negotiating, often trying to save their people from annihilation, but unable to match the organized power arriving from the north. In religious terms, the papacy could claim success. It had demonstrated that doctrinal defiance could be confronted not only with preaching but with armies, provided political allies were available. Out of this victory came one of the most consequential institutional developments in medieval Europe, a permanent system for hunting down heresy through specialized tribunals. The Church concluded that bishops were too entangled in local interests to conduct an aggressive purge. Papal envoys faced limited cooperation. The answer was to create a new machinery staffed by men whose identity and career depended entirely on enforcement. The new preaching orders supplied exactly that type of personnel. Over time, the role of these specialists hardened into a standing institution, feared for its reach and persistence, even where local clergy resisted its presence. Politically, the Crusade transformed France. The great southern principality was cut down, its autonomy dismantled piece by piece, and the region was slowly drawn into the orbit of the crown. Even when local dynastic rule returned in reduced form, marriage alliances ensured that the monarchy would eventually inherit the remaining claims. By the later 13th century, the south was absorbed into royal control, a development that might have taken far longer without the religious conflict that opened the door. At the peak of his authority, Innocent sought to seal these achievements with a vast church council in Rome. Representatives arrived in enormous numbers, and the gathering projected the image of a unified Christian world under papal leadership. The council focused heavily on defining and combating heresy, tightening control over preaching, and regulating doctrine and discipline. It also confirmed the rising importance of the new religious orders and renewed the call for another crusade, setting plans in motion and offering spiritual incentives to revive fading enthusiasm. For the papacy, it was a moment of triumph, an image of command, coherence, and universal reach. Not long after, Innocent died suddenly while still attempting to coordinate European powers for a renewed campaign toward the east. His death did not erase his impact. The papacy that followed bore the imprint of his methods and ambitions. Yet the decades after him did not bring calm. The conflict between empire and papacy continued with new intensity, shaped increasingly by the personality of the emperor who would dominate the next generation, Frederick II. Frederick was young, brilliant, and dangerously adaptable. He could be bold when force was needed and subtle when diplomacy offered a better route. During Innocent's lifetime, earlier bonds of guardianship had restrained open war, and Frederick also had to secure his own position within the empire. Innocent's successor was a calmer figure, more inclined to negotiation, but unwilling to surrender the gains Rome had secured. An agreement was reached, and Frederick received the imperial crown in Rome, presenting himself as a loyal son of the Church. The real flashpoint remained northern Italy. The cities of Lombardy had continued to develop their own political life. Imperial authority existed mostly on paper, and the towns had learned to thrive without meaningful imperial oversight. Any attempt to tighten control threatened the independence they had come to see as normal. Frederick, however, treated Italian sovereignty as the core of his imperial vision. Tension rose, alliances revived, and the old League traditions returned when the cities sensed danger. For a moment, mediation prevented open war, but the situation hardened when a more aggressive pope took power and treated Frederick's success in northern Italy as an existential threat. If the emperor controlled both north and south, the papacy would be trapped in the middle. To weaken Frederick, Rome pushed him toward a crusade. He had promised to go, delayed repeatedly, and was punished. When he finally departed without first repairing relations with the Pope, he was punished again. The contradiction was not accidental, it reflected the deeper struggle. A crusade that removed the emperor from Italy could protect papal interests, but an emperor acting independently could not be allowed to claim moral victory abroad. In the East, Frederick chose negotiation over mass warfare, securing an outcome that, from a practical perspective, was unusually favourable for Christian interests. Yet this very pragmatism enraged his enemies. A ruler who bargained with Muslim powers rather than destroying them could be painted as spiritually suspect. Frederick responded with fierce propaganda of his own, insisting he was no heretic and portraying the papacy as the true danger to European governments. By this stage, excommunication was treated less as a mystical terror and more as a weapon in a political war. A temporary peace followed. Emperor and Pope met, declared mutual goodwill and publicly reconciled. Frederick used the breathing space to reshape his southern kingdom with a degree of administrative discipline that stood far ahead of most European states. He built centralized courts, a professional bureaucracy, systematic taxation, and a standing military apparatus. The goal was clear: to crush any private rights, whether noble or clerical, that prevented direct royal control over justice and revenue. It was government by deliberate design, built to function efficiently and sharply hostile to the loose compromises of feudal society. He did not impose the same model on Germany, where political tradition and noble independence made such centralization nearly impossible. There, his authority still depended on bargaining with princes and buying cooperation through concessions. Even so, attempts to strengthen public order appeared, including declarations meant to restrain private warfare and encourage stability. Meanwhile, legal thought in the German lands developed in its own direction, producing influential summaries of customary law and triggering anxieties in Rome that such traditions might strengthen rulers and weaken papal leverage. War returned in Italy. Frederick moved with greater force than before, blending different military elements, including mercenary-style troops that gave him flexibility and speed. The Lombard coalition tried to avoid battle but was outmaneuvered. A sudden reversal turned an apparent imperial retreat into a trap, and the city forces fought hard but were defeated. Milan again bore the heaviest cost, submitting under harsh terms. Frederick then sought to build a counterweight to the cities by empowering regional nobles and aggressive local strongmen. Figures associated with ruthless political violence rose under his protection, becoming early examples of the brutal urban tyranny that would later appear across the peninsula. The papacy could not accept this trajectory. A renewed excommunication followed, framed this time as a release of subjects from loyalty to the emperor. Frederick replied by appealing beyond Italy, warning Europe's rulers that papal policy threatened every government that wished to act independently. The conflict escalated toward a showdown. The Pope attempted to gather church leaders for a council in Rome, hoping to unite Christendom against the emperor. Frederick aimed to prevent the council from meeting at all. A fleet battle at sea ended with captured clergy carried off as prisoners, a stunning humiliation for papal authority. Rome itself faced direct pressure, and only internal resolve within the city prevented an immediate collapse. Then, at the height of the crisis, the Pope, still the driving force behind Rome's resistance, died suddenly, leaving the struggle unresolved and the next phase of the contest ready to begin. The balance between emperor and papacy remained unchanged. A newly elected pope died within weeks, leaving the church in uncertainty once again. The cardinals delayed their next decision for a long time, caught between the pressure of imperial influence and the demands of those hostile to it. Eventually they chose a candidate from Genoa, a man whose family background had traditionally been sympathetic to imperial interests. At first glance, the outcome seemed favourable to Frederick. Yet he understood the deeper reality and remarked that no pope could truly serve the imperial cause. The appearance of reconciliation followed, with ceremonies and promises suggesting a renewed harmony. But the peace proved as fragile as earlier agreements. Behind the formal gestures, conflict continued to shape every decision. The new pope soon pursued a strategy already attempted by his predecessors. He sought support from the wider Christian world against the emperor. Escaping from Rome, he travelled first to Genoa and then to France, a land that had repeatedly provided refuge for embattled popes, and would continue to do so for generations. From the city of Lyon he summoned a grand council, presenting it as an assembly concerned with the welfare of all Christendom, though the struggle with the empire stood at its centre. Frederick sent representatives trained in the emerging discipline of legal scholarship, and they defended his position with impressive skill. Their arguments framed the emperor's cause as the cause of all rulers who wished to protect their independence. Yet Europe's princes were not prepared to risk open confrontation. The council ultimately supported the Pope and declared Frederick removed from imperial authority. The remaining years of Frederick's life were consumed by efforts to gather allies across Europe. Many political forces had reason to fear the growing power of the papacy, but uniting them proved nearly impossible. The empire had never exercised more than symbolic leadership over the kingdoms of Europe, and now each state was increasingly conscious of its own sovereignty. Even where Frederick's fierce criticism of papal ambition a sympathetic audience, it did not translate into practical cooperation. France and England, rather than joining his cause, simply strengthened their own defences against outside interference. Meanwhile, the papacy pursued a clear objective: the destruction of the imperial house that had long challenged its authority. In Germany, it encouraged the election of a rival king to undermine Frederick's dynasty. In Italy, it continued to support all territories and cities opposed to imperial control. The old party labels took on new meaning. Those who resisted the emperor were described collectively as opponents of imperial power, regardless of whether their motives were loyalty to the Pope, commitment to civic independence, or simple political calculation. Attention also turned towards southern Italy, where the papacy sought to remove the ruling dynasty and replace it with one more favourable to its interests. The political traditions of the peninsula encouraged such manoeuvring. Italian powers often preferred divided authority, believing that competing masters could be balanced against one another. The situation seemed to offer an opportunity to weaken imperial influence permanently. Frederick died without reconciliation, leaving his heirs to inherit the long struggle. His son Conrad held authority in Germany, despite repeated challenges from rival claimants. He also inherited the crown of Sicily, though real power in that kingdom increasingly rested with Manfred, an energetic and charismatic, illegitimate son of Frederick. Manfred quickly became a central figure in the region, admired by the population and surrounded by an aura of legend that blurred the line between history and myth. When Conrad died suddenly, the question of succession reopened. The papacy had never forgotten its claim that the Sicilian kingdom was held under its authority, and it moved to enforce this claim. Military preparations began, and negotiations were opened with Manfred. Lacking a secure legal claim to the throne, he initially sought papal recognition in hopes of legitimizing his rule. The Pope, however, had no intention of strengthening the imperial line in Italy. His death soon afterward encouraged resistance among those who favoured independence. A young heir from the imperial family still existed, but he was a child and the connection with Germany had never been popular in the south. Manfred, by contrast, embodied the qualities admired by the local population. Acting first as regent, he eventually secured election as king, having successfully defended the kingdom against its enemies and restored order within its borders. Under Manfred's leadership, the kingdom revived quickly. The administrative reforms introduced earlier had strengthened government, improved stability, and promised a prosperous future. At the same time, a new plan was taking shape. The papacy began negotiations with France, seeking to bring a foreign ruler into southern Italy. This alliance would have lasting consequences for the peninsula's political history. A French pope persuaded the French king to allow his brother, Charles of Anjou, to claim the Sicilian throne. The campaign was presented as a religious undertaking, even though the targeted kingdom was peaceful, governed by its own laws, and not guilty of doctrinal rebellion. Opposition to papal authority itself had become sufficient justification for war. Charles of Anjou proved a determined and ambitious leader. Landing in Italy, he received political authority in Rome and was formally invested with the southern crown. Manfred moved to confront him, and the decisive battle was fought near Benevento. After prolonged delay, the invader finally secured victory. The defeat of Manfred marked a turning point, though the struggle was not yet complete. The papacy soon discovered that its chosen champion could not easily be controlled. Charles pursued his own ambitions with relentless energy, showing little concern for local traditions or interests. He emerged as the dominant figure among those opposed to the imperial cause and exercised authority across the peninsula with remarkable independence. Cities placed their trust in him, granting him extraordinary powers, and for a time no effective rival remained. Yet resistance soon found a new leader. The young Conrad, heir of the imperial line, came of age and inspired renewed hope among supporters of the old dynasty. Courageous and energetic, he attracted the loyalty of those who opposed foreign domination. He entered Italy with considerable support, and even Rome, briefly under sympathetic leadership, welcomed him. His campaign gathered strength, fueled by dissatisfaction in the south. The decisive confrontation came in southern Italy. At first, victory seemed within his grasp, but a sudden counterattack by Charles reversed the outcome. The young leader was forced to flee, but was eventually captured. His execution, carried out without mercy, ended the imperial dynasty's claim in Italy. The long conflict that had begun decades earlier with dynastic ambitions in the south reached its tragic conclusion. The elimination of the imperial line marked a decisive moment in European history. The empire ceased to assert meaningful authority in Italy, and its influence in Germany weakened significantly. The decades that followed were marked by political fragmentation, with rulers bearing royal titles, but exercising limited, effective power. Yet the triumph of the papacy also revealed its own limitations. The same forces that had enabled its rise would soon challenge its dominance. National monarchies were strengthening, and their rulers increasingly resisted external control. The later 13th century witnessed profound transformation across Europe. In England, representative institutions began to take permanent form, giving broader segments of society a role in government. In Germany, the ruling house shifted its ambitions toward regional consolidation, abandoning dreams of universal authority. In France, the monarchy expanded its control over the kingdom and confronted papal power directly, relying on domestic support rather than fearing ecclesiastical sanctions. In Italy, the decline of imperial influence did not lead to papal supremacy, but instead encouraged the rise of local political factions focused on regional interests. Urban republics developed stable political systems that would shape their future. In one major city, political authority shifted to the wealthy commercial classes, reflecting the growing power of industry and trade. In another, control became firmly concentrated in the hands of a hereditary aristocracy that dominated Mediterranean commerce. In both cases, there was no room for the universal authority once claimed by medieval emperors. The ideals that had shaped earlier centuries were gradually giving way to new forms of political organization. Against this backdrop, attention turns to another defining feature of the medieval world: the movement commonly known as the Crusades. The centuries between the 11th and 13th centuries are often described as an age defined by these campaigns. Yet they should be understood not as the sole explanation for social change, but as one powerful expression of the religious and political forces of the time. Rather than a series of isolated events, the crusading spirit represented a continuous flow of enthusiasm, sometimes surging into large military expeditions, and at other times persisting through smaller ventures and individual journeys. The idea of uniting the Christian world to secure Jerusalem and the sacred places of the faith had deep roots. Early proposals reflected concern that these holy sites were under non-Christian control. Yet, for a long time, conditions in the region did not produce widespread alarm. Earlier, Muslim rulers had governed territories that included many Christian populations, and relations were often shaped by coexistence rather than intense hostility. The situation changed when new powers emerged in the Near East. Warrior groups from Central Asia advanced into the region, transforming political conditions and creating new tensions with Christian communities. Their expansion threatened established powers and disrupted long-standing patterns of pilgrimage. Faced with growing danger, the Eastern Christian Empire appealed to the West for assistance. This request offered the papacy an opportunity to expand its influence and perhaps strengthen its authority over the divided Christian world. Plans for a major military expedition were considered, but delayed by other political conflicts. The idea, however, continued to gain support. As the authority of the papacy grew and a sense of shared religious identity spread across Europe, conditions became favourable for a unified response. The decisive moment came when a powerful appeal was made to defend the sacred places and aid fellow Christians. Large assemblies gathered, and the call to arms ignited extraordinary enthusiasm. Religious emotion swept through crowds of nobles, clergy, and ordinary people alike. The cause was framed as a sacred duty, and the belief spread that participation would bring spiritual reward. The movement quickly took on two distinct forms. On one side stood the organized military forces of European nobility, preparing carefully for a campaign in distant lands. On the other appeared vast popular movements composed of peasants and townspeople, driven by intense faith but lacking discipline or resources. These groups set out in great numbers, often without planning or leadership, and many suffered terribly along the way. Their journeys revealed both the idealism and the chaos of the early crusading impulse. Meanwhile, the military expedition gathered strength. Prominent leaders from across Europe assembled their forces and began the long journey eastward. Their cooperation was loose and often unstable, shaped by personal ambition as much as by shared purpose. Each commander sought glory and advantage, and unity existed only when circumstances required it. Upon reaching the Eastern Empire, tensions quickly emerged. The emperor who had requested assistance needed the Crusaders' strength but feared their ambitions. He required them to swear loyalty and promise that conquered lands would be returned to imperial control. The arrangement reflected mutual suspicion rather than genuine partnership. Despite these difficulties, the crusading armies advanced into enemy territory, capturing strategic cities after long and difficult campaigns. Victories demonstrated the effectiveness of their military organization, yet disputes over conquered lands revealed deep divisions among the leaders. Eventually, the armies reached their ultimate objective. After intense fighting, Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders, fulfilling the central aim of the expedition. The conquest raised immediate questions about governance. Various possibilities were debated, including rule by the church or by secular princes. A compromise emerged. Spiritual authority would be held by ecclesiastical leadership, while temporal power would rest with a lay ruler responsible for defense. A new political order was established, modeled on familiar European institutions. The territories gained during the campaign were divided into several independent states, rather than unified under a single authority. This fragmentation reflected the personal ambitions of the leaders and limited the long-term strength of the new order. Many crusaders soon returned home, their obligations fulfilled, leaving a small number of settlers to maintain control over vast and unfamiliar lands. In the years that followed, migration from Europe slowly increased the population of these eastern territories. Pilgrims travelled regularly to the holy places, and commercial cities organised transport across the Mediterranean. What began as military conquest gradually took on the character of colonisation. Settlers cultivated the land, trade expanded, and local populations reappeared, creating a complex society shaped by coexistence and tension. From this point onward, the history of the crusading era followed two separate paths. One involved continued military expeditions from Europe, driven by renewed waves of religious enthusiasm. The other concerned the daily realities of governing and defending the territories established in the East. Together, these parallel developments shaped a defining chapter in the transformation of medieval Europe. In a newly conquered land far from Europe, there was little debate about what kind of government should be established. The settlers naturally brought with them the political system they knew best. By this time, feudalism had become deeply rooted in the European mindset. It was flexible, adaptable, and seemed especially suited to organising relationships between rulers and warriors in unfamiliar territories. For leaders attempting to build authority in distant lands, it offered a ready-made structure. Yet its central weakness also followed it wherever it went. The bonds connecting the ruler to his subordinates were often fragile, making unity difficult to maintain. Two striking examples show how feudalism could be deliberately imposed rather than gradually developed. One was Norman England after the conquest of William, and the other was the kingdom established by the Crusaders in Jerusalem during the early 12th century. In most parts of Europe, feudalism had grown slowly out of local military and economic needs, adjusting itself over time to changing political pressures. In these two cases, however, it was consciously introduced as a complete system. Its structure and consequences were clearly understood from the beginning, and different elements of the system were emphasized depending on local circumstances. In England, the conqueror imposed a strong centralized version of feudal rule. William had behind him a loyal group of followers already bound to him by personal loyalty and expectation of reward. As a result, the system placed heavy emphasis on the obligations of subjects to the king and reinforced royal authority. In Jerusalem, the situation was entirely different. The Crusader leaders were individuals from various lands, each seeking fortune and advancement. They chose a king from among themselves, but he depended on their support rather than commanding their obedience. Consequently, feudal practices in Jerusalem favoured the independence of powerful nobles and limited the authority of the crown as much as possible. Tradition later credited Godfrey of Bouillon, the early ruler of Jerusalem, with establishing a written legal code that defined this Eastern feudal order. Modern scholarship suggests that the code was compiled decades after his time. Known as the Assizes of Jerusalem, it served as a guide for courts dealing with property disputes and public order. The system it described effectively legalized a condition of political fragmentation. It weakened border defences, wasted resources, and ignored the importance of merchants and farmers who formed the economic foundation of a stable society. The kingdom's laws ensured that authority remained divided and ineffective. Considering these internal weaknesses, it is remarkable that the Crusader states in Syria survived as long as they did. Their endurance can partly be explained by the fear inspired by their early military successes. In open battle, heavily armed Christian forces often defeated much larger Muslim armies. Their skill in siege warfare and fortress defense surpassed that of their opponents. Control of fortified coastal cities and strategic strongholds gave them a firm hold on key regions. The coastal lands also held particular importance for European settlers because of their commercial value, even if they were less significant to their enemies. Another crucial factor in their survival was the steady arrival of reinforcements from Europe. Many who travelled east were motivated by religious devotion, but the promise of combat also attracted warriors eager for adventure. Over time, a permanent class of professional defenders emerged. These were members of military religious orders who vowed to remain in the region and dedicate their lives to protecting Christian territories. During the period between the First and Second Crusades, three major military orders took shape. These organizations combined two ideas that had once seemed incompatible: the religious life of monks and the warrior ideals of knights. The Knights of St. John began as caretakers for wounded soldiers and sick pilgrims. Providing medical care soon required armed protection, and the group gradually evolved into a military organization. As their reputation grew, they acquired property throughout Europe to support their activities, eventually rivaling traditional monastic institutions in wealth and influence. The Order of the Temple emerged with a more direct military purpose. Its members were tasked with defending pilgrimage routes and protecting frontier regions. They were given quarters near the site of the ancient temple in Jerusalem, from which they took their name. The Teutonic Order originated when a German merchant in Jerusalem provided assistance to pilgrims from his homeland. What began as a charitable effort soon developed into a military force devoted to defending Christian territories. These military orders became the backbone of the Crusader states. Their permanent presence in the region allowed them to master local conditions and adapt their strategies accordingly. Over time, their close contact with Muslim societies led them to develop a more nuanced understanding of their opponents. This familiarity sometimes softened the intense hostility that had originally inspired the crusading movement, and contributed to later criticism of their loyalty and purpose. Their development closely mirrored that of traditional monastic institutions. Like monks in cloisters, they lived apart from ordinary society and accumulated large estates across Europe. Gradually, many lost sight of their founding mission and became increasingly concerned with wealth and influence. After the decline of the crusading movement, the Teutonic Order established a powerful territorial state in northeastern Europe, while the Templars, surrounded by suspicion and envied for their riches, were eventually suppressed by European rulers, eager to seize their wealth. The Order of St. John endured longer than the others, relocating its base first to Rhodes and later to Malta, where it continued to exist in altered form. The 50 years following the First Crusade saw these developments unfold while the political situation in the East appeared relatively stable. That stability was shattered when the city of Edessa, a key Christian outpost, fell to Muslim forces in the mid-12th century. News of its capture shocked Europe and sparked renewed enthusiasm for another crusade. The society that responded to this call differed significantly from that which had supported the earlier expedition. Religious reform movements were flourishing, and influential spiritual leaders encouraged rulers to view participation in the crusade as the highest form of service. Kings of major European powers took up the cause. Louis VII of France and Conrad of Germany led large armies toward the east. Despite their size and preparation, these forces suffered from poor coordination and lack of understanding of local conditions. Many perished before reaching their destination. The campaign achieved no lasting success, and the enormous expenditure of lives and resources produced little benefit for the Christian territories. A generation later, the balance of power shifted again. Muslim forces under the leadership of Saladin unified Egypt and Syria, creating a formidable challenge to the Crusader states. Known for his intelligence and discipline, Saladin initially sought peaceful coexistence, but repeated violations of agreements by Christian forces led to open conflict. His decisive victory near Tiberias resulted in the capture of Jerusalem and the collapse of most Christian holdings in the region, leaving only a narrow coastal territory under their control. The loss of Jerusalem provoked another massive response from Europe. Powerful monarchs, including the rulers of Germany, France, and England, launched a new campaign. Despite displays of courage and occasional victories, internal rivalries and poor coordination again undermined the effort. A negotiated settlement eventually allowed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem while leaving the city under Muslim control. By the time of the Fourth Crusade, the original religious purpose of the movement had been overshadowed by political and economic interests. Instead of attacking Muslim territories, crusading forces were diverted toward Constantinople. Influenced by commercial ambitions and political intrigue, they captured the city and established a Latin empire. This event transformed relations between Eastern and Western Christianity and reshaped the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Later, expeditions continued to pursue control of the Holy Land, but their objectives were increasingly shaped by practical considerations. Frederick II, a ruler of unusual intellect and pragmatism, chose negotiation over warfare. Through diplomacy, he secured control of Jerusalem without bloodshed, demonstrating a new approach to relations between Christian and Muslim powers. His methods, however, clashed with prevailing religious attitudes and provoked fierce opposition. The final major crusading efforts, led by Louis IX of France, revived the earlier spirit of religious enthusiasm but repeated the same strategic failures. By the mid-13th century, Muslim powers had regained dominance, and Christian territories in the east gradually disappeared. The era of large-scale crusading campaigns came to an end, leaving behind a legacy that reshaped European society in unexpected ways. The crusading movement reflected a powerful idealism characteristic of the medieval world. It expressed a willingness to pursue religious goals, regardless of practical consequences. This spirit influenced many aspects of European life, from philosophy and politics to religious organization. It also contributed to outbreaks of persecution against religious minorities and reinforced demands for religious conformity. The period even witnessed extraordinary events such as popular movements of children and peasants who believed they were divinely called to recover the Holy Land. Though many of these efforts ended in tragedy, they revealed the depth of religious emotion that shaped medieval society. The Crusades also encouraged expansion and conquest beyond the eastern Mediterranean. European powers extended their influence into new regions, including parts of Spain, Eastern Europe, and the Baltic lands. German settlers moved eastward, establishing new communities and strengthening frontier territories. Military orders played a central role in these expansions, spreading European political and cultural structures into previously independent regions. Rather than uniting Europe, however, the Crusades often strengthened national identities. Armies, composed of different peoples, frequently clashed over leadership and priorities. Distinct languages and cultural traditions remained strong, and cooperation was temporary rather than permanent. Among the settlers in the East, French language and culture became dominant, shaping the character of the Crusader states. In the end, the crusading era produced consequences far beyond its original goals. It stimulated trade, encouraged cultural exchange, and intensified contact between distant regions. It reshaped political institutions, transformed economic relationships, and altered the balance of power across Europe and the Mediterranean world. What began as a religious movement evolved into a complex historical process that influenced nearly every aspect of medieval civilization. Within Europe itself, developments during the age of the Crusades followed a different path from those in the Eastern territories. Rather than producing a unified political structure, this period witnessed the gradual awakening of national identity. The most prominent figures associated with the crusading movement were also powerful champions of emerging national authority. Rulers such as Richard of England, Frederick Barbarossa, Philip Augustus of France, Louis IX and Frederick II left, lasting marks on their own kingdoms, by strengthening centralized rule and challenging the loose loyalties of feudal society. Their policies and ambitions contributed to the growing sense that political power should be tied to a defined realm and its people rather than to shifting personal alliances. At the same time, the institution that had once provided the strongest unifying influence across Europe began to lose its commanding position. The Roman papacy, which had played a decisive role in launching the early Crusades, gradually found itself unable to control the forces it had helped unleash. By the beginning of the 13th century, its authority no longer carried unquestioned weight. Powerful political actors pursued their own interests, regardless of papal opinion. The commercial leaders of Venice openly ignored ecclesiastical warnings when it suited their ambitions, while rulers such as Frederick II adopted policies shaped by practical concerns rather than religious directives. The later crusading efforts, often conducted under strong papal influence, ended in costly failures that revealed the limits of papal leadership in political and military affairs. Instead of suppressing national feeling, the crusading movement ultimately encouraged its growth. At the same time, a different development was taking shape alongside this strengthening of national identity. Increasing contact between regions fostered new forms of cooperation and mutual recognition among different peoples. This early sense of international conduct emerged most clearly in the trading cities of Italy, whose economic activity expanded rapidly during the crusading era. Their competition for commercial advantage gradually led to agreements and practices that regulated relations between states and merchants. In the diplomacy of Frederick II, both with Italian cities and with Muslim rulers, a similar spirit can be observed. Though far from reflecting modern ideas of equality among nations, these interactions reveal the beginnings of more balanced and practical relations across political and religious boundaries. The concept that different societies might coexist and negotiate their interests had begun to take root. The influence of the Crusades on intellectual life presents a more complex question. Muslim societies possessed advanced learning in fields such as science and philosophy, and European contact with them coincided with a period of growing intellectual development in the West. Yet it would be misleading to attribute this transformation entirely to crusading encounters. Long before these expeditions, Europe had already been undergoing gradual cultural and educational change. The preservation and transmission of ancient Greek knowledge by Arabic scholars contributed to this process. But the decisive turning point came from a renewed interest in classical Greek and Roman civilization itself. This intellectual revival developed largely through internal European forces, though contact with other cultures may have accelerated its progress. The impact of the Crusades is more visible in the field of literature. The movement provided an immense store of new themes and heroic narratives. The Crusader became the central figure of medieval storytelling, celebrated as the embodiment of courage, adventure, and religious devotion. Poets and chroniclers transformed real events into dramatic tales that shaped the early development of European languages. The journey to distant lands exposed participants to unfamiliar cultures and experiences, offering young nobles opportunities to explore the world beyond their homelands. These encounters often challenged traditional assumptions, and broadened perspectives. Such experiences gradually encouraged a new outlook on human life. Participants discovered that other societies possessed their own forms of wisdom, morality, and religious devotion. These observations weakened the belief that European Christianity alone represented the entirety of civilization. The exposure to diverse ways of living encouraged reflection on human experience itself, helping to prepare the intellectual climate that would later give rise to renewed interest in classical learning and the dignity of human achievement. Although the Crusades were not the sole cause of this transformation, they contributed to the gradual shift toward a more human-centered understanding of culture and knowledge. Economic and commercial changes resulting from the Crusades are more clearly measurable. As long as Christian powers controlled sections of the Syrian coast, trade routes connected the markets of the East with the expanding economies of Europe. The Crusader states themselves never developed strong agricultural or industrial systems, largely because their rulers focused on immediate gain rather than long-term development. Instead, the commercial cities of Italy made the greatest use of these connections, establishing trading networks that linked Eastern products with Western demand. European markets were enriched by the arrival of luxury goods from the East. Spices, textiles, glassware, dyes, fruits, and other valuable items entered Western commerce in increasing quantities. In return, European traders supplied weapons, horses, clothing, and grain to sustain the settlers in the East. The regular import of food supplies revealed the limited agricultural productivity of the Crusader territories and demonstrated their dependence on European support. This expansion of trade required a more sophisticated economic system than medieval Europe had previously known. Before the Crusades, money had played only a limited role in daily life. Feudal society had relied largely on land-based rewards rather than monetary payment. Public officials, soldiers, and administrators were compensated through rights to property rather than through wages. The demands of long-distance expeditions, however, made ready cash essential. Crusaders needed funds to equip themselves and to sustain their journeys across unfamiliar lands. As a result, financial practices developed rapidly. Moneylending, once widely condemned as immoral, became increasingly common. The risks of travel and warfare encouraged high interest rates, but the need for financial services outweighed moral objections. Italian merchants pioneered new methods of credit and exchange, allowing travelers to conduct transactions across vast distances. A variety of currencies circulated in the Eastern Mediterranean, and traders even introduced coins designed to be accepted by both Christian and Muslim markets. Economic necessity thus encouraged practical cooperation across religious divisions. Taken together, these developments show that the crusading era brought profound changes to European life. Many of the transformations associated with this period had begun earlier, but the movement intensified and accelerated them. Constant travel and cultural exchange expanded Europe's awareness of the wider world. Political structures evolved, economic systems grew more complex, and intellectual horizons broadened. The original religious objective of controlling sacred territory gradually lost importance beside these wider consequences. Meanwhile, the political landscape of Europe itself continued to evolve. In Germany and Italy, local powers remained the primary centres of authority. Regional leaders governed territories shaped by long-standing traditions and loyalties, while larger political units emerged as loose federations formed for defence and cooperation. In Germany, these regional entities often reflected distinct ethnic identities, and loyalty to local rulers rested upon shared cultural heritage. In Italy, political authority depended less on ethnicity and more on privileges granted by successive rulers. In both regions, monarchy remained weak. Kings were chosen through election rather than hereditary succession, and their authority depended on negotiation with powerful nobles. Efforts by ambitious families to secure permanent royal power often failed, leading to the acceptance of external rulers as a compromise solution. France, at the end of the Carolingian period, displayed similar conditions. The territory that would eventually become the French kingdom consisted of diverse regions marked by distinct cultural traditions and political structures. Differences between northern and southern populations reflected deep historical divisions. In the south, Roman cultural influence remained strong, and local independence persisted despite attempts at centralized control. In the north, feudal principalities developed around local leaders who exercised considerable autonomy. Various regions maintained their own identities and political ambitions. Aquitaine, Gascony, Burgundy, Flanders, and other territories functioned largely as independent powers, each pursuing its own interests. In the centre of northern France, however, a small domain around Paris gradually became the foundation of a future monarchy. From this region emerged a ruling family whose persistence and political skill eventually allowed it to dominate French politics. The struggles of early French rulers reveal the fragile nature of royal authority. Kings depended on the support of powerful nobles and faced constant challenges to their legitimacy. Rival claimants, shifting alliances, and regional conflicts shaped the political landscape. The monarchy survived not through absolute power, but through careful negotiation and compromise with local elites. External threats also influenced political developments. Viking incursions along the western coasts forced rulers to adopt pragmatic solutions, including granting land to invading leaders in exchange for loyalty and conversion to Christianity. The establishment of Normandy under such arrangements demonstrated the effectiveness of practical governance over traditional claims of legitimacy. Conflicts between kings and nobles often reflected deeper tensions about the nature of authority. Efforts by rulers to assert independence or to rely on new advisors frequently provoked resistance from aristocratic elites, determined to preserve their privileges. The balance between royal power and feudal autonomy remained unstable, with political outcomes shaped by shifting alliances and military strength. Throughout this period, Europe was characterized by a complex interplay of local loyalties, emerging national identities, and evolving political institutions. The crusading age, while driven by religious ideals, ultimately contributed to broader transformations in governance, economy, and culture. Its legacy was not the permanent control of distant lands, but the reshaping of European society itself, preparing the way for the political and intellectual developments of the centuries that followed. At first sight, the political landscape of early medieval Europe can appear chaotic and unstable. Authority seemed fragmented, rival powers competed constantly, and no clear constitutional system guided political decisions. If disorder is defined as the absence of established principles for governing public life, then both sides of the Rhine experienced such a condition. Yet beneath this apparent confusion, deeper forces were reshaping society. What looked like disorder was in reality a transitional phase, as older structures gave way to new forms of political organization. In the case of France, later historical interpretations often distort this process. Because the principle of hereditary monarchy eventually triumphed, historians sometimes describe the struggles of the period as a simple conflict between a sacred royal dynasty and rebellious challengers. In reality, the situation was more complex. The established Carolingian tradition was weakening, while new political realities were emerging. The central force behind this transformation was the consistent policy pursued by the powerful Dukes of Francia, who gradually shaped a new political order. When King Raoul died without an heir, Hugh, son of Robert, supported the claim of Louis, the young son of Charles the Simple, who had grown up in England. The leading nobles accepted this arrangement and invited the young prince to assume the French crown. Unlike rulers elsewhere in Europe, however, this Carolingian king possessed almost no territorial base. He did not represent a strong regional power tied to ancestral lands. His position depended entirely on the loyalty of supporters, which had to be maintained through careful distribution of favours and alliances. The clergy, in particular, looked to him for protection against the growing influence of secular lords, and their support became one of his few reliable resources. For nearly 2 decades, the French monarchy remained in the hands of this energetic and capable ruler, yet he achieved little lasting success. He struggled to defend the kingdom against external threats from Norse raiders in the west and Hungarian incursions in the east. The princes who had pledged loyalty to him proved unreliable. Even his marriage alliances failed to secure stable political support, as rival factions formed shifting partnerships. Meanwhile, the German king maintained relations with different French leaders according to his own interests, treating the French crown as only one factor among many in regional politics. When Louis died, he left no real power behind him, only unresolved conflicts and financial weakness. In contrast, the German monarchy during the same period gradually strengthened its authority and achieved greater unity. In France, however, the monarchy remained fragile, overshadowed by powerful regional lords. Louis was succeeded by his son Lothair, whose long reign continued the same pattern of struggle. He sought to establish a territorial foundation strong enough to resist the growing influence of the feudal nobility. One of his main strategies was to use his connections with the Eastern Kingdom to counterbalance his domestic rivals. At one point, he attempted to reclaim Lorraine and briefly forced the German ruler to retreat. Yet such campaigns produced little lasting change. Military actions often consisted more of symbolic displays of strength than decisive battles. Regional princes defended their independence but resisted foreign domination, particularly from the German Empire. After Lothair's death, his son Louis briefly inherited the crown, but died soon afterward. The final Carolingian rulers of France were energetic and capable men, yet they confronted forces beyond their control. The age of kings without real power had ended. Political authority increasingly depended on tangible resources, such as land, wealth, and loyal followers, rather than inherited claims alone. This situation opened the way for the rise of Hugh Capet. With the Carolingian line weakened and no claimant commanding strong national support, the leading nobles faced a crucial decision. The only remaining Carolingian candidate held lands under German authority, which made him unacceptable to many. At the same time, the feudal princes preferred a ruler who would respect their independence rather than challenge it. Hugh of Francia appeared to offer the ideal solution. He was a major landholder, connected by family ties to many powerful nobles, and closely associated with the church. He seemed strong enough to rule, yet unlikely to threaten the feudal order. At an assembly of nobles and church leaders, it was declared that the crown should not pass automatically by inheritance, but should belong to the individual most capable of governing. Hugh was chosen and crowned king. His election marked the beginning of a new political era. The monarchy now rested not on ancient tradition, but on the support of the leading powers of the realm. The kingship that emerged under Hugh possessed a dual character. On one hand, the king stood at the top of the feudal hierarchy as the supreme lord of vassals. On the other hand, he also represented a broader idea of sovereignty, associated with religious authority and the administration of justice. This second concept portrayed the king as a figure invested with sacred responsibility, standing above ordinary political relationships. Throughout French history, these two ideas coexisted and often competed. The development of the French monarchy can be understood as a gradual effort to strengthen the second aspect of kingship. The king sought to transform his role from that of a feudal overlord among many to that of a sovereign ruler with direct authority over all subjects. During the early centuries, this transformation proceeded slowly. Yet the foundations laid during this period proved decisive for the future. Several factors contributed to the consolidation of royal power. One of the most important was the establishment of hereditary succession. Although the monarchy remained technically elective, kings increasingly secured recognition of their heirs during their own lifetimes. Over time, this practice created a stable line of succession and reduced disputes over the crown. Another crucial development was the adoption of primogeniture. Earlier dynasties had divided their territories among multiple heirs, weakening royal authority and encouraging conflict. The Capetian rulers gradually established the principle that the eldest son alone would inherit the crown. This practice prevented fragmentation and strengthened continuity. Equally significant was the steady expansion of the royal domain. At the beginning of Capetian rule, the crown possessed little independent wealth. The new dynasty therefore relied on its own family lands and gradually increased its holdings through inheritance, marriage, and political opportunity. Rather than pursuing risky military expansion, early Capetian rulers followed a cautious strategy, preserving their resources and waiting for favourable circumstances to enlarge their territories. Over time, this policy produced substantial gains. Territories were added when local rulers died without heirs or when strategic marriages brought lands under royal control. Although many of these acquisitions were small, together they strengthened the economic and political foundations of the monarchy. By the 13th century, the French king controlled a vast collection of territories, giving him a decisive advantage over rival nobles. As royal power expanded, the monarchy developed new methods of administration. Like other medieval rulers, the king governed through officials who served as personal agents. These officers handled financial, judicial, and administrative duties, forming the core of the royal government. Their authority derived directly from the king, and their growing importance helped to centralize political power. At the same time, the monarchy faced constant challenges in enforcing its authority beyond its own lands. Powerful vassals often ignored royal commands unless compliance served their interests. The king, therefore, relied heavily on church leaders, whose authority and resources made them valuable allies against secular rivals. To improve administration, the monarchy gradually created new offices responsible for local governance. Officials were appointed to collect revenues, administer justice, and represent royal authority in the provinces. Although these positions sometimes became hereditary and independent, further reforms introduced new officials whose loyalty to the crown was carefully maintained through regular supervision and financial compensation. These administrative innovations strengthened the monarchy's ability to collect taxes, enforce laws, and maintain order. Royal agents extended the reach of central authority into regions that had previously been dominated by local powers. Through this process, the monarchy developed the institutional structure necessary for effective governance. The king's authority also depended on councils and assemblies that advised him and approved his decisions. Medieval rulers rarely acted alone, and public acts required the consent of leading nobles and church officials. Over time, these assemblies became more organized, eventually giving rise to permanent institutions responsible for administration, justice, and financial management. By the late Middle Ages, the French monarchy had evolved into a powerful centralized state. The king commanded the loyalty of his subjects, controlled substantial financial resources, and maintained a professional administration. He possessed the means to enforce his authority and defend his realm against both internal and external threats. This transformation marked the emergence of a new political order. What had begun as a fragmented system of feudal relationships gradually developed into a unified monarchy with strong institutions and centralized authority. The long process of transition from medieval fragmentation to modern statehood had reached a decisive stage, shaping the future of France and influencing the broader development of European political life.